Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Catskills in October should have been beautiful. Should have been the kind of place where corporate team building retreats actually work, where forced camaraderie might bloom into something genuine under the canopy of gold and crimson leaves. Instead, as I stood on the lodge's weathered deck watching my coworkers settle into their assigned cabins, the mountains felt like walls closing in. Our company had rented the entire Pinewood retreat for 4 days. 37 employees scattered across a dozen rustic buildings connected by gravel paths that crunched underfoot like broken bones. The kind of place that probably looked charming in the brochure, but felt different when you were actually there, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean in too close and shadows that moved wrong in your peripheral vision. I'd been with the firm for 6 years, long enough to know that these retreats were less about team building and more about budget allocation. Show the board some photos of employees doing trust falls and rope courses. Justify the expense. Check the box for corporate culture. But standing there in the fading afternoon light, listening to the distant laughter from the main lodge mixing with the whisper of wind through bare branches, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way our coordinator kept checking his watch, or how the lodge staff avoided eye contact. Maybe it was just the isolation. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, nothing but 300 acres of wilderness and whatever entertainment value could be squeezed from forced interaction with people I saw 40 hours a week anyway. The coordinator, let's call him Davidson since that's what his name tag said, had been running these corporate retreats for 15 years according to his opening speech. Tall, lean, with the kind of practiced enthusiasm that comes from repeating the same motivational phrases to different groups of reluctant participants. He had this habit of gesturing with his whole arm when he talked, sweeping movements that made him look like he was conducting an invisible orchestra. That first evening, after dinner and the obligatory icebreaker games, I found myself outside our cabin cluster with a handful of colleagues. The air had turned sharp with the promise of frost, and most people had retreated indoors to the warmth of artificial fireplaces and complimentary hot chocolate. I was enjoying the quiet, the way the darkness seemed to muffle even our hushed conversations. That's when I saw him. Davidson stood maybe 30 yards away, just inside the tree line, his silhouette barely visible against the deeper blackness of the forest. He was facing me, one arm raised in a gesture I recognized, the same sweeping motion he'd been making all day, but slower now, more deliberate. When he caught my attention, he pressed a finger to his lips and beckoned me forward with his other hand. I looked back at my coworkers, still talking in their small circle on the deck, then back toward the trees. Davidson had taken a step deeper into the woods, still gesturing for me to follow. There was something urgent in his posture, something that suggested this wasn't part of the scheduled activities. I started walking toward him, my feet finding the narrow trail that led into the forest. The gravel gave way to soft earth and fallen leaves that whispered secrets with each step. Behind me, the warm glow of the lodge lights began to fade, swallowed by the reaching branches overhead. But then I heard it. Davidson's voice, clear and unmistakable, calling out behind me from the direction of the deck. His trademark laugh, the one that punctuated every team-building exercise, echoing across the open space. I turned around, confused, and saw him there on the lodge deck, gesticulating to the group just as he had been when I'd started walking away. When I looked back toward the forest, the figure was gone. I stood there in the darkness between the trees and the lodge, caught in a space that felt suddenly too quiet. The rational part of my mind immediately began constructing explanations. Poor lighting, fatigue from travel, maybe one of the other retreat staff who resembled Davidson from a distance. But the certainty I'd felt when I first saw him, the absolute recognition, made those explanations feel thin and insufficient. I returned to the group, brushing off questions about where I'd been. Davidson was leading them through some trust exercise that involved sharing childhood fears, his voice animated and engaged in the way that meant he'd never left the deck. When he glanced my way, there was no recognition in his expression, No acknowledgement that he'd just been beckoning me into the woods. Sleep came fitfully that night. The cabin walls seemed thinner than they should have been. Every settling creak and wind-shifted branch amplified in the darkness. I found myself listening for footsteps on the gravel paths, for the sound of someone moving between the buildings when they shouldn't be. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with figures at the edge of vision, always turning away, just as I tried to focus on them. The second day passed normally enough. Trust falls and problem-solving exercises, team lunches where we pretended to discover new things about people we'd worked alongside for years. Davidson was his usual energetic self, guiding us through activities with the smooth professionalism of someone who'd done this countless times before. I found myself watching him more carefully, looking for any sign that he remembered our encounter in the woods. But his interactions with me were no different from anyone else's. As evening approached, I convinced myself that the previous night had been exactly what logic suggested. A case of mistaken identity and poor lighting, combined with the disorienting effects of being in an unfamiliar environment. The human mind, after all, was notorious for filling in gaps with patterns that didn't actually exist. But then it happened again. This time I was walking back from the dining hall after dinner, taking the long way around the building to avoid a group that was heading to the lodge's game room. The night was clear and cold, stars visible between the cloud cover in a way they never were back in the city. I was enjoying the solitude, the brief respite from forced socialization. That's when I heard my name being called softly from the shadows beside the dining hall. Not exactly called, more like whispered, the way someone might get your attention without wanting to disturb others nearby. I looked toward the sound and saw Davidson again, partially hidden by the building's overhang, motioning for me to approach. But even as I registered his presence, I could hear his voice coming from inside the dining hall behind me. He was speaking into the microphone they'd set up for the evening presentation, his words carrying clearly through the windows. Something about tomorrow's activities, delivered in the same upbeat tone he'd used all weekend. I stood frozen, listening to his voice from two directions simultaneously. The figure by the building continued to beckon, more insistently now, and I felt an almost physical pull to follow. But the impossibility of the situation held me in place, my mind struggling to process what I was experiencing. That's when I remembered the voice recorder app on my phone. Without thinking, I opened it and hit record, holding the device toward the figure in the shadows, while Davidson's amplified voice continued to drift from the dining hall behind me. The shadow Davidson stepped closer, emerging partially into the light, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. It was him, absolutely, undeniably him. Same features, same expression of focused intensity he wore during the more challenging team exercises. His mouth moved as if he were speaking, though I couldn't hear any words. I found myself responding, the words coming out automatically. "I'm coming," I said, or meant to say, taking a step toward him. But I hadn't opened my mouth. The words had come from my phone's speaker, played back in my own voice even as Davidson continued his presentation inside the building. The recording was somehow playing back my response before I'd given it, my voice confirming something I hadn't yet decided to do. I looked down at the phone in confusion, then back up toward the figure. He was gone again, vanished into the darkness as completely as if he'd never been there. Inside the dining hall, Davidson's presentation continued without interruption, his voice warm and professional as he outlined the next day's schedule. I stopped the recording and immediately played it back. 4 minutes and 37 seconds of ambient sound, wind in the trees, distant voices from inside the building, Davidson's presentation filtering through the windows. And there, at the 2-minute mark, clear as if I were standing right next to the microphone, my own voice saying, "I'm coming," in a tone of resignation I didn't remember using, but I hadn't spoken. I was certain of that. I'd been standing there silently, paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was seeing. Yet the recording suggested otherwise, capturing a response I'd given to a summons I couldn't be sure I'd actually received. I played it back 3 more times, each listening more unsettling than the last. The quality was too clear, the timing too precise. It wasn't an echo or some kind of audio artifact. It was my voice, speaking words I didn't remember saying. responding to something that might not have been there. That night, I didn't even pretend to try sleeping. I sat in the uncomfortable desk chair by the cabin's single window, watching the paths between buildings and listening for any sound that didn't belong. The recording played on an endless loop in my head, my voice saying words I couldn't remember speaking to a person who couldn't have been there. The rational explanations felt increasingly inadequate. Stress, lack of sleep, the disorienting effects of being away from familiar surroundings, all of it true, but insufficient to explain the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with this place, with this situation, with my own perception of reality. I found myself thinking about the other employees, wondering if any of them had experienced anything similar. But how do you ask someone if they've seen duplicate coordinators without sounding like you're having a breakdown? How do you explain that your phone recorded words you're certain you never spoke? The third day brought a fog that rolled in from the mountains like something alive, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet in any direction. The scheduled outdoor activities were moved inside, compressed into trust exercises and problem-solving workshops that felt increasingly claustrophobic. Davidson was as enthusiastic as ever, but I caught him looking at me more often now, his gaze lingering in a way that felt deliberate. During lunch, I managed to sit near a couple of colleagues who'd been with the company longer than I had. Casual conversation revealed that they'd done retreats at this location before, that the company had been using Pinewood for 3 years running. When I mentioned Davidson, they exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. "He's good at what he does," one of them said carefully. "Really makes you feel like you're part of something bigger." "Sometimes too good," the other added, then changed the subject before I could ask what that meant. I spent the afternoon workshops in a state of hypervigilance, watching Davidson's every movement, listening to the cadence of his voice. He seemed normal enough, professional, engaging, occasionally humorous in the way that corporate trainers learn to be. But there was something else now, a quality I couldn't name. The way he would pause mid-sentence sometimes, as if listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. The way his eyes would drift toward the windows, scanning the fog-shrouded grounds with an intensity that suggested he was looking for something specific. As evening approached, I made a decision. I wouldn't wait for another encounter. I would go looking for answers, armed with my phone and whatever courage I could muster. If Davidson, or whatever was masquerading as Davidson, wanted my attention, I would give it to him on my terms. The fog had thickened as night fell, turning the retreat grounds into a maze of half-visible shapes and muffled sounds. I could hear voices from the lodge, the warm murmur of people gathered around the fireplace for the evening social hour. Davidson was in there with them. I'd confirmed his presence before leaving the building. I walked slowly along the path toward the forest, my phone ready to record, my senses strained to catch any sign of movement in the shifting gray curtain around me. The gravel crunched under my feet with each step, the sound seeming to carry too far in the muffled air. 20 yards from the tree line, I stopped and waited. The fog swirled around me, occasionally parting to reveal glimpses of the forest beyond before closing again like a living thing. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, my breathing shallow and quick in the cold air. "I know you're out there," I said quietly, my voice swallowed by the fog almost before it left my mouth. "What do you want?" The response came not as words but as a sound, my own voice, drifting from somewhere ahead of me in the trees, repeating the same phrase I'd unknowingly spoken the night before. "I'm coming." But this time I was certain I hadn't said anything. This time I was listening for it, waiting for it, and still my voice reached me from the forest like an answer to a question I hadn't yet asked. I started the recording and moved toward the sound, following my own voice deeper into the woods than I'd gone before. The fog was thinner here, filtered by the canopy above, and I could make out the shapes of trees and fallen logs with increasing clarity. My recorded voice led me deeper, always just ahead, always just out of sight. Behind me, growing fainter with distance, I could still hear the real Davidson's voice drifting from the lodge, leading the evening's activities with his characteristic enthusiasm. But ahead of me, my own voice continued to call from the darkness, drawing me forward with words I'd never consciously chosen to speak. I followed that impossible sound until the lodge lights were completely lost behind me. until the fog had given way to the clear darkness of deep forest, until I stood in a small clearing I was certain I'd never seen before. The air here felt different, thicker, charged with something that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the cold. In the center of the clearing stood Davidson, not beckoning this time, not gesturing for me to follow, but simply standing there looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows at the clearing's edge, were others, figures I almost recognized, shapes that might have been my co-workers if not for the way they stood too still, watched too intently. "You came?" Davidson said, his voice carrying clearly across the space between us. It was his voice, the same tone and inflection I'd been hearing all weekend, but somehow different now. Emptier, as if the words were being spoken by someone who understood their meaning but not their purpose. I raised my phone, still recording, and asked the question that had been building in me since that first night. "Who are you?" He smiled then, the same professional smile he'd been wearing all weekend, and gestured toward the figures behind him with that familiar sweeping motion. "We're exactly who you think we are. The question is, who are you?" Before I could respond, my own voice answered from the phone's speaker. "I don't know." But I hadn't spoken. I was certain of that. As certain as I could be of anything anymore. Yet there it was, my voice giving an answer I couldn't remember providing to a question I was still trying to understand. The figures in the shadows stepped forward then, and I saw their faces clearly for the first time. My co-workers, yes, but wrong somehow. Too perfect, too focused, like photographs that had been touched up just enough to slide into the uncanny valley. They looked at me with the same expectant expression Davidson wore, waiting for something I couldn't name. "The retreat ends tomorrow," Davidson said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. "But some people decide to extend their stay. The mountains can be very accommodating to those who really want to be part of something bigger." I looked down at my phone, still recording, and realized I had no idea how long I'd been in the clearing. The timestamp showed only minutes, but it felt like hours. The battery indicator showed full charge despite having been running low when I'd started the recording. "I need to get back," I said, backing toward the edge of the clearing. "Of course," Davidson agreed readily, "but you'll find your way here again. They always do." I turned and ran then, crashing through the underbrush in what I hoped was the direction of the lodge. Behind me I could hear my co-workers' voices calling my name, but when I looked back, the clearing was empty. Just trees and shadows and the sound of my own panicked breathing. I emerged from the forest to find the lodge exactly where it should have been, warm light spilling from its windows onto the fog-dampened ground. Inside, I could hear Davidson leading the group in some kind of closing ceremony, his voice as animated and engaging as ever. When I burst through the front door, everyone turned to look at me, including Davidson, who showed no recognition of our encounter in the woods. "There you are," he said cheerfully. "We were just wrapping up for the evening. Perfect timing." I looked around the room at my co-workers, studying their faces for any sign of the too perfect wrongness I'd seen in the clearing, but they all looked normal, tired from the long day, ready for the retreat to be over, exactly as they should have looked. "Where were you?" someone asked. "We haven't seen you since dinner." But I'd just been talking to Davidson in the forest. I'd just seen half of them standing in that clearing like mannequins in a store window. The phone in my pocket felt heavy with evidence, but when I checked the recording, it showed only ambient forest sounds and the distant murmur of voices from the lodge. No conversation, no questions or answers, no impossible echo of my own voice speaking words I'd never said. Just me, talking to empty air in the middle of the woods, while the real Davidson led the real activities back at the lodge where I was supposed to be. I spent that final night staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past 3 days, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what I'd experienced. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself that it had all been stress and isolation, and the kind of minor psychological break that comes from too much forced socialization in an unfamiliar environment. Almost. But as we packed our bags and prepared to leave Pinewood Retreat, I found myself looking back at the forest one last time, and there, just visible between the trees, I saw Davidson watching me. The real Davidson was loading luggage into the bus behind me, chatting with other employees about the drive back to the city. But the other one, the one in the forest, raised his hand in that familiar sweeping gesture. And I felt my own hand start to rise in response before I forced it back to my side and climbed onto the bus without looking back. The recording app on my phone shows 17 separate files from that weekend. 17 instances where I apparently thought something was worth documenting. But when I play them back, they're all the same. Ambient forest sounds, distant voices, and nothing else. Just me, standing alone in the woods, talking to shadows that may or may not have been there. The only exception is the last one. 3 minutes and 42 seconds of forest sounds. And then, right at the end, clear as if I were standing next to the microphone, my own voice saying, "I'll be back." I don't remember saying that. I don't remember feeling that. But the timestamp shows it was recorded just minutes before we left the retreat. Sometimes, late at night in my city apartment, I find myself looking up the Pinewood Retreat website. They have an opening for a permanent position, assisting with corporate team building activities. The salary is competitive, the benefits comprehensive, and the mountains are beautiful year-round. I haven't applied yet, but I keep the browser window open, just in case. And sometimes, when the city gets too loud and the walls feel too close, I can hear my recorded voice whispering from somewhere far away. I'll be back. I'm starting to think it wasn't a prediction. I'm starting to think it was a promise. Story 2. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I blamed my memory. After all, when you spend 8 months meticulously crafting a miniature metropolis, every street corner becomes burned into your consciousness. Or so I thought. I had been working on the diorama for nearly a year, transforming the entire attic space above my apartment into an elaborate scale model of an imaginary city. What started as a weekend hobby had consumed my evenings, my weekends, and eventually my savings. The city sprawled across 4 interconnected plywood tables, featuring everything from a downtown financial district complete with LED-lit skyscrapers to suburban neighborhoods with hand-painted Victorian houses. I had even installed a working streetlight system, controlled by a timer that automatically illuminated the miniature streets as dusk fell outside my real windows. The attention to detail bordered on obsessive. Each building had been carefully weathered with acrylic paints and fine sandpaper. Tiny figures populated the sidewalks, businessmen frozen mid-stride, couples sharing park benches, children playing in meticulously landscaped squares. I had researched urban planning principles, studying traffic flow patterns and zoning regulations to make the city feel authentic. The elevated highway that curved through the eastern section had taken 3 weeks to construct, its concrete supports hand-carved from foam and painted to show years of imaginary weather damage. That Tuesday evening in October, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic as I did every night after work, carrying my tackle box of modeling supplies and a steaming cup of coffee. The familiar scent of plastic cement and acrylic paint hung in the air, mixed with the dusty smell of old wood beams. But something felt different the moment I reached the top step. The highway overpass that should have arced over 5th Street now stretched across what I knew to be Maple Avenue. The positioning was impossible. I had spent days calculating the precise angle and elevation to ensure it aligned with the street grid below. Yet there it stood, exactly as I had built it, but in entirely the wrong location. I set down my coffee with trembling hands and walked around the table, examining the structure from multiple angles. The overpass itself was perfect, every detail intact down to the tiny graffiti tags I had carefully applied with a fine tip marker. But its position defied logic. The supporting columns that had once anchored it above 5th Street now rose from completely different foundations. My mind scrambled for rational explanations. Perhaps I had misremembered the layout. Working by lamplight for hours each evening could play tricks on perception. But as I studied the rest of the city, more inconsistencies emerged like a spreading infection of wrongness. The street signs throughout the business district had been rearranged. What I remembered as the intersection of Commerce and 3rd now bore signs reading Pine and 7th. The small parking garage behind the miniature bank now faced west instead of east, its tiny entrance ramp leading in the opposite direction. Most disturbing of all, the row of brownstone apartments along the northern edge had been rotated to face away from the park I had positioned them to overlook, as if the buildings themselves had decided they preferred a different view. I spent the next hour documenting every discrepancy I could find, filling 3 pages of a notebook with inconsistencies that seemed to multiply the longer I looked. The rational part of my mind insisted I was simply misremembering details, that months of intensive work had created false memories of the city's layout. But the more I examined my creation, the more convinced I became that something had physically altered it during my absence. The following evening, I implemented what I thought was a foolproof test. Before leaving for work, I attached a single strand of my own hair to the doorframe at the top of the attic stairs, positioning it at eye level where anyone entering would surely break it. Additionally, I filled a drinking glass with water and placed it in the center of the main table, reasoning that even the slightest vibration would leave evidence of disturbance. When I returned home that evening, my heart hammered against my ribs as I climbed the stairs. The hair remained perfectly intact, stretched taut across the doorway like an invisible tripwire that had caught nothing. The water glass sat exactly where I had left it, filled to the same level, not a single drop spilled on the table's surface. Yet the city had changed again. The changes this time were more subtle, but no less impossible. The entire downtown financial district had rotated approximately 30 degrees clockwise. The buildings remained in their relative positions to each other, but the entire cluster now faced a different direction. The miniature traffic lights that I had painstakingly wired throughout the city maintained their rhythmic cycling of red, yellow, and green, but they now controlled intersections that had been repositioned in impossible ways. Most unsettling was the discovery that every single building in the residential section had turned to face the eastern window of the attic. Where once the tiny houses and apartment buildings had been oriented toward the miniature streets and parks I had created for them, they now presented their facades toward the real world beyond the glass, like an audience of architectural spectators waiting for a performance to begin. I began staying later in the attic each evening, sometimes until well past midnight, hoping to catch whatever force was responsible for these changes. The silence up there was absolute except for the occasional settling sounds of the old house and the nearly inaudible hum of the LED streetlights. I would sit in the corner chair I had positioned for detailed work, watching the city in the amber glow of the miniature street lamps, waiting for something to move. Nothing ever did. The tiny figures remained frozen in their eternal routines. The traffic lights continued their patient cycles, and the buildings maintained their architectural vigil. Yet each morning brought new impossibilities. By the end of the week, I had documented over 40 separate changes to the city's layout. Street patterns had been altered, entire city blocks had swapped positions, and building orientations shifted like a slowly rotating kaleidoscope. The subway system I had constructed beneath the city, visible through clear plastic panels, showed signs of similar reorganization, though the tunnels themselves seemed to maintain their structural integrity, even as they connected stations that had never been designed to link together. I began to notice patterns in the changes. The alterations seemed to follow some internal logic that I couldn't quite grasp, as if the city was evolving according to rules I had never programmed into its design. Traffic flow patterns that had once frustrated me now flowed more smoothly. The awkward gap between the shopping district and the residential area had been elegantly bridged by buildings that had somehow migrated from other sections of the city. The realization that struck me most forcefully was that the changes were improvements. Whatever was reorganizing my city possessed a better understanding of urban planning than I did. The layout was becoming more efficient, more aesthetically pleasing, more alive. It was as if the miniature metropolis had developed opinions about its own design and was implementing them when I wasn't watching. I started spending entire nights in the attic, sleeping in an old recliner I dragged up from the basement. My work suffered as exhaustion accumulated, but I couldn't abandon my vigil. The city called to me with an intensity that bordered on compulsion. I found myself studying every minute detail, memorizing the position of individual cars on the tiny streets, counting the windows in each building, noting the orientation of every park bench and street lamp. Still, the changes continued. My presence seemed to make no difference to whatever force was reshaping the city. During brief moments when I dozed, despite my best efforts to stay alert, entire sections would shift and realign themselves. I began to suspect that the changes happened not when I was absent, but when I wasn't actively observing specific areas of the diorama. It was as if the city existed in a state of constant potential motion, frozen only by the weight of my direct attention. The breakthrough came on a particularly foggy November evening. I had been staring at the central plaza for over an hour, determined to catch any movement in my peripheral vision, when I noticed something that made my skin crawl with recognition. The tiny figures scattered throughout the plaza, business people, shoppers, a jogger frozen mid-stride, were all facing the same direction. Not toward the fountain at the plaza's center, not toward the shops lining its edges, but toward the corner where I sat watching them. Every single miniature person in the plaza had turned to look at me. I blinked hard and refocused my eyes, certain that fatigue was creating hallucinations, but the orientation remained unchanged. Dozens of tiny painted faces, each no larger than a pinhead, directed their attention toward my corner of the attic with an unanimity that seemed impossibly coordinated. Slowly, carefully, I shifted my position to a different corner of the room. Within minutes, I could see that the figures had begun to turn. Not all at once, but gradually, like flowers following the sun's path across the sky. By the time I had settled into my new observation post, every person in the plaza was once again facing my direction. I tried moving to different vantage points around the room, and each time, the same thing happened. The tiny inhabitants of my city tracked my movement with the patience of hunters waiting for prey to emerge from cover. When I stood directly above the central business district, every figure on every street below adjusted their orientation to look up at me through the artificial sky of the attic ceiling. The implications of what I was witnessing made my hands shake uncontrollably. Either I was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown, or my model city had developed some form of awareness that centered entirely on my presence. Both possibilities terrified me equally. I began testing the boundaries of this phenomenon. When I focused intently on a specific section of the city, the figures there would freeze in place, maintaining whatever poses they held. But in areas outside my direct attention, I could sense movement in my peripheral vision, subtle shifts and realignments that stopped the moment I turned to look directly. The buildings themselves seemed to participate in this strange dance of attention. Structures that I observed directly remained stable and fixed, but those at the edges of my vision appeared to shimmer slightly, as if existing in a state of potential transformation. I started to understand that the city was most active in the spaces I wasn't actively watching, reorganizing itself in the shadows of my perception. One night, as I sat exhausted in my chair after nearly 14 hours of observation, I made a decision that still haunts me. I would close my eyes for exactly 1 minute, and then document whatever changes occurred during that brief period of non-observation. I set the timer on my phone, took careful note of every detail visible from my position, and closed my eyes. The silence in the attic seemed to intensify immediately. What had felt like perfect quiet before now revealed itself to be filled with the faintest suggestion of sound. Not quite whispers, not quite movement, but something that existed at the very threshold of perception. It was as if the entire city had been holding its breath while I watched, and was now finally exhaling. When the timer chimed and I opened my eyes, the city had changed more dramatically than ever before. Not just individual buildings or street layouts, but the fundamental character of the place. What had been a cheerful, well-lit urban environment now felt somehow darker, more ominous. The streetlights still functioned, but their warm yellow glow seemed harsher, casting sharp shadows that created angular patterns of darkness throughout the miniature landscape. Every single building in the city now faced inward, toward the center of the diorama, creating a circular arrangement that reminded me uncomfortably of an amphitheater. At the very center of this formation, in what had previously been the main plaza, stood a single new structure that I definitely had not built. It was a perfect scale model of the house I lived in, complete with the attic where I now sat. And in the tiny window of the model attic, Barely visible even with the magnifying glass I kept nearby, was a miniature figure seated in a chair, apparently looking down at an even smaller model city spread out before him. I stared at this impossible recursion until my eyes watered, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The detail was perfect, far beyond anything I could have created even with months of dedicated work. Every shingle on the roof, every brick in the foundation, every pane of glass in the windows had been rendered with microscopic precision. But it was the figure in the attic window that truly unnerved me. As I watched through my magnifying glass, the tiny representation of myself appeared to be moving, shifting slightly in his miniature chair, occasionally raising what might have been an equally miniature magnifying glass to examine his own impossible city in greater detail. I spent the rest of that night in a state of paralyzed fascination, unable to look away from the model of my house, and unable to fully process what its presence meant. Dawn was breaking outside the real windows of my attic when I finally noticed that the figure in the model had turned to look directly at me, his tiny painted features somehow conveying an expression of recognition that transcended the limitations of his scale. That was when I understood that I had never been watching the city. The city had been watching me. Every carefully planned street layout, every meticulously positioned building, every tiny inhabitant frozen in their eternal routines, all of it had been designed not as a representation of urban life, but as an elaborate observation apparatus. The changes I had documented, the impossible reorganizations that defied my memory and my security measures, had never been random alterations to my creation. They had been adjustments to improve the city's capacity to study me. The model house at the center of the diorama continued to watch me through its impossibly detailed windows as I finally understood the true nature of what I had built. Not a city, but a consciousness. Not a hobby, but a habitat. Not a model of life, but life itself, scaled down to a size that could fit in my attic, and scaled up to a complexity that could comprehend its creator. I remain in my chair as I write this, afraid to move, afraid to sleep, afraid to look away. The city below me continues its patient observation. Every building turned inward, every street realigned to provide optimal sightlines, every inhabitant maintaining their eternal vigil. And in the model house at the center of it all, the tiny figure that represents me continues to build his own impossible city, while something even smaller watches him from an even more miniature attic, in a recursion that might extend infinitely inward, each layer of reality observing the one below it, each observer becoming the observed. I no longer remember which layer of this endless nesting I actually occupy. The city remembers, though. The city always remembers. Story 3. The mark on the wall stares back at me like a knowing eye. It wasn't there before the fall, I'm certain of it. I've lived in this apartment for 3 years, cleaned every tile in that laundry room countless times, scrubbed away soap residue and lint with methodical precision. The half-moon-shaped smudge sits exactly where my skull would have cracked against the ceramic, a dull gray stain that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. But I didn't fall. Something pushed me forward. The memory replays in slow motion, each detail crystallizing with unwelcome clarity. I had been reaching for the highest shelf, arms stretched above my head, when the stool shifted beneath my feet. My body tilted backward, gravity claiming me with hungry fingers. The wall rushed toward my head like a pale predator, and in that suspended moment before impact, I felt it, a firm, dry pressure against my spine, the unmistakable sensation of a palm, broader than my own, pressing between my shoulder blades with deliberate force. The push sent me lurching forward instead of back. I crashed into the shelving unit, arms wrapping around the metal frame in desperate embrace while my heart hammered against my ribs. The suitcases above rattled ominously but held their positions. When I finally steadied myself and looked around, the laundry room was exactly as I'd left it. Empty, sterile, unchanged, except for the trembling in my hands that wouldn't stop for 20 minutes. That night, I tried to recreate the fall. Scientific method, I told myself. Logical analysis. I positioned a thick mattress behind the stool and deliberately lost my balance, documenting the trajectory of my body as it fell. 3 attempts. 3 identical results. My head would have struck the wall with considerable force had the mattress not been there. No phantom hands intervened. No mysterious pressure redirected my path. The evidence should have been reassuring. Instead, it made everything worse. The mark appeared the following evening, manifesting like a bruise on pale skin. I discovered it during my nightly routine, the same ritual I'd maintained since moving here, checking locks, turning off lights, ensuring everything was in its proper place. The smudge seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, demanding attention while somehow resisting direct observation. When I stared at it head-on, it appeared ordinary enough, just a stain on a wall. But the moment I looked away, it seemed to shift, to breathe, to watch. I spent an hour trying to scrub it away with bleach and determination. The chemical burn in my nostrils was sharp enough to bring tears, but the mark remained unchanged. If anything, it seemed darker afterward, more defined, as though my efforts had only made it stronger. Sleep became elusive. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt that pressure again, not just on my back now, but everywhere. Fingertips trailing along my arms, breath against my neck, the weight of someone standing beside my bed, patient and silent. I would snap awake, pulse racing, and scan the darkness for shapes that shouldn't be there. The apartment always appeared empty, filled only with the familiar shadows of my furniture and the distant hum of traffic below. But emptiness, I learned, could be the most terrifying presence of all. Days blurred together in a haze of hypervigilance. I began avoiding the laundry room entirely, carrying dirty clothes to the building's communal facilities on the ground floor. The detour added 40 minutes to my routine, but it was preferable to facing that mark again, to feeling the way it seemed to track my movements like a lazy predator evaluating prey. The building superintendent, a weathered man whose perpetual 5 o'clock shadow made him look perpetually exhausted, noticed my changed habits during one of our encounters in the lobby. His observation was casual, almost disinterested. Something about seeing me use the downstairs machines lately. I mumbled an excuse about my upstairs washer making strange noises, but his eyes held a flicker of something that might have been understanding, or amusement. Apartments hold on to things sometimes, he said before walking away, leaving me standing by the mailboxes with a chill creeping up my spine. The comment lodged itself in my brain like a splinter, festering with implication. What kinds of things? From whom? And why now? After 3 years of peaceful cohabitation with whatever presence might share these walls? I began researching the building's history with the obsessive thoroughness of someone who needed answers more than sleep. Public records revealed a structure built in 1962, converted to apartments in the early 80s. Previous tenants came and went with normal frequency. Young professionals, retirees, the occasional family. Nothing unusual. No tragic deaths, no mysterious disappearances, no headlines that might explain the growing sense of being observed. Yet the feeling intensified with each passing day. It started with peripheral movement, shadows that shouldn't shift when nothing was moving to cast them, glimpses of motion and reflective surfaces that didn't correspond to my own actions, the sensation of being followed through my own apartment, an invisible companion maintaining just enough distance to remain undetectable, but close enough to make my skin crawl with awareness. The mark in the laundry room began appearing elsewhere. First, a similar smudge materialized on the bathroom mirror, positioned exactly at head height. Then another on the kitchen wall, directly where my skull would meet the surface if I slipped while reaching for dishes. Each mark held the same qualities as the original, that strange light-absorbing quality, that sense of patient watching, that resistance to cleaning efforts that bordered on the supernatural. I documented everything with photographs, desperate for objective evidence that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. But the images never captured what I saw with my naked eyes. In the photos, the marks appeared as ordinary stains, unremarkable and easily explained. The disconnect between perception and documentation only deepened my sense of unraveling. Friends began noticing changes in my behavior, though their observations felt like they were coming from a great distance. comments about my appearance, had I been sleeping poorly, and my distracted responses to conversations that I couldn't quite follow. The world beyond my apartment walls seemed increasingly irrelevant, a faded backdrop to the growing drama unfolding within these four walls. I installed security cameras with mounting desperation, 4 units covering every angle of the main living areas, recording continuously to cloud storage that I checked obsessively throughout the day. Hours of footage revealed nothing unusual, just me moving through empty rooms, occasionally pausing to stare at walls or mirrors with an intensity that looked unsettling even to myself. But the recordings couldn't capture what I felt during those moments of frozen attention. The sense of something vast and patient pressing against the edges of my consciousness. The certainty that I was being evaluated, measured, tested in ways I couldn't comprehend. The touching escalated gradually, so subtly that I initially dismissed each incident as imagination or tired muscles. A brush against my shoulder while cooking dinner, fingers trailing through my hair while I read. The distinct sensation of someone sitting on the edge of my bed, the mattress depressing under invisible weight while I lay rigid with terror, afraid to open my eyes and confirm what couldn't possibly be there. Each contact felt increasingly deliberate, purposeful, not malicious exactly, but not benevolent either, and more like the attention of a researcher studying an interesting specimen, clinical in its thorough examination. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when I found myself pressed against the laundry room wall, my face inches from the original mark. I had no memory of walking there, no conscious decision to confront what I'd been avoiding for weeks. One moment I was washing dishes in the kitchen, the next I was standing in the doorway, drawn by a compulsion that felt alien and irresistible. The mark had changed. What had been a simple half-moon shape now showed complex detail, whorls and ridges that resembled fingerprints, texture that suggested depth despite the flat surface of the tile. As I stared, transfixed, I could swear I saw it pulse with slow, rhythmic movement, like a sleeping heart. My hand rose without conscious command, fingers extending toward the wall. The air between my palm and the mark felt thick, resistant, as though I was pushing through invisible honey. Heat radiated from the spot, and I could smell something metallic and organic, like copper pennies mixed with garden soil. "What do you want?" The words escaped my lips before I could stop them, hanging in the still air like an invocation. The answer came not as sound but as pressure, that same firm, dry sensation I'd felt during my fall, but now everywhere at once. Surrounding me, supporting me, holding me upright while my legs threatened to give way. In that moment of complete contact, I understood with terrible clarity that I had never been alone in this apartment. Something had been here when I arrived, had watched me settle into its space, had been waiting with infinite patience for me to acknowledge its presence. The revelation should have been terrifying. Instead, I felt an unexpected wash of relief, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. The marks on the walls, the phantom touches, the sense of being observed, all of it suddenly made perfect sense. I wasn't going crazy. I wasn't alone. But I also wasn't entirely myself anymore. Standing there in the laundry room, surrounded by that encompassing pressure, I realized that the boundary between my consciousness and whatever shared this space had been gradually dissolving. Each mark on the wall represented not a threat, but a connection point. Each phantom touch was an attempt at communication. The presence hadn't been studying me. It had been merging with me, slowly and carefully, like water seeping into sand. I pulled my hand back from the wall and staggered out of the room, my heart hammering with new understanding. The apartment felt different now, charged with acknowledged recognition. The shadows held substance. The silence hummed with conversation I was only beginning to hear. Later that night, lying in bed with every light in the apartment blazing, I tried to determine when I had last felt truly alone. The answer eluded me, slipping away like smoke whenever I tried to grasp it. Perhaps I had never been alone here. Perhaps the person who had signed the lease 3 years ago had been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of occupancy. The marks continued to appear, but I no longer tried to clean them away. They were road signs now, markers of a territory that belonged to something larger than my individual consciousness. Each morning brought new evidence of our shared existence. Objects moved slightly from their original positions, the persistent sensation of being gently guided through daily routines, the growing awareness that my thoughts were not entirely my own. I stopped using the security cameras. What was the point of documenting something that existed in the spaces between official reality? Instead, I began leaving small offerings around the apartment. A glass of water here, a piece of bread there. Though I couldn't say why this felt necessary or appropriate. Friends and family noticed my increasing isolation, but their concerns felt like they were directed at someone else entirely. The person they remembered was fading, becoming part of something larger and less defined. When they called, I found myself struggling to remember why their voices had once seemed important, why their problems had once demanded my attention. The apartment had become a world unto itself, complete and self-contained. Why would I ever need to leave? As I write this, sitting at my kitchen table while something rustles through papers in the next room, I can feel myself becoming more distributed, less concentrated. The marks on the walls pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, or perhaps my heart has learned to match their rhythm. Either way, the distinction grows less meaningful with each passing hour. Tomorrow, I think I'll remove all the mirrors, not because I'm afraid of what I might see, but because reflection requires separation, and separation is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. We are learning to occupy the same space gracefully, like dancers who have finally found their rhythm. The mark on the laundry room wall stares back at me like a knowing eye, and I realize now that it always has been exactly that. A point of contact, a doorway, a gentle reminder that some spaces are never truly empty, only waiting for the right moment to reveal their true occupants. I am no longer certain where I end and where this presence begins. Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps that's what home really means. Story 4. The fluorescent lights in the parking garage hummed their electric lullaby as I patted down my jacket pockets for the third time. Nothing. The familiar weight of my access badge was missing, leaving behind only the phantom sensation of something that should have been there but wasn't. I'd been through 6 meetings that day, each one blending into the next like watercolors in rain. Budget reviews, project updates, strategic planning sessions that felt more like strategic stalling. Somewhere between the third-floor conference room and the lobby, my lifeline to the building had vanished. The security guard at the front desk had that look, the one that said he'd seen this dance 1,000 times before. Frazzled office workers retracing their steps, patting themselves down like they were being frisked by invisible hands. He'd let me back up to search, his eyes following me with the patience of someone paid to watch other people's minor disasters unfold. I'd torn through my bag with the desperation of a man searching for his last cigarette. Every pocket, every compartment, every fold of fabric had been violated by my increasingly frantic fingers. The elevator floor had been scoured, my shoes kicked off to check if somehow the badge had slipped inside. Even the cramped space behind the buttons had been inspected, my phone's flashlight revealing nothing but dust and the occasional paperclip. The car had been next. Glove compartment emptied, seats lifted, floor mats peeled back like I was looking for contraband. The trunk had surrendered its secrets. Jumper cables, emergency kit, a tennis racket I hadn't used in 2 years, but no badge. By the time I'd climbed the 3 flights to my apartment, my legs felt like they'd been filled with wet concrete. The building's elevator had been out of service for a week, and each step up the narrow stairwell felt like climbing out of a grave. The hallway stretched before me, carpeted in that particular shade of beige that seemed designed to absorb hope and enthusiasm. That's when I saw it. The badge lay in the exact center of the corridor, perfectly aligned with the carpet's weave. Not dropped or tossed or fallen, but placed, positioned with the kind of precision that made my skin crawl. The laminated photo faced upward, and even from 15 feet away, I could see my own face staring back at me from the floor. My feet had stopped moving without any conscious decision on my part. The hallway suddenly felt longer, wider, as if the walls had stepped back to give this moment more room to breathe. The silence was absolute. No hum of air conditioning, No muffled television sounds from neighboring apartments. No traffic noise filtering up from the street below. I approached the badge like it might bite. When I bent to pick it up, my fingers trembled against the smooth plastic. The photo was crisp, unfaded, exactly as it should be, but the badge felt wrong in my hand. Too warm, as if it had been held by someone else just moments before. The elevator at the end of the hall chose that moment to ding, its doors sliding open to reveal empty space. I watched those doors close again, the mechanical sounds echoing off the walls like a countdown to something I couldn't name. My apartment door looked the same as always. Same scratches around the lock from years of fumbling with keys in the dark. Same peeling number stuck to the wood with industrial adhesive. But as I slid my key into the deadbolt, I noticed something that made my throat tighten. The lock turned too easily. No resistance, no familiar catch that required just the right amount of pressure. It opened like it had been waiting for me. Inside, everything appeared normal. Kitchen clean, living room undisturbed, bedroom exactly as I'd left it that morning. But normal felt artificial now, like a stage set dressed to look lived in. I found myself checking details I'd never noticed before. The angle of the remote control on the coffee table, the way my books leaned against each other on the shelf, whether the bathroom towel hung the same way I always left it. The paranoia crept in slowly, like cold water rising around my ankles. I called the building's front desk, and the security guard confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. The hallway cameras had gone dark for exactly 3 minutes. Not black screen dark, but staticky, unfocused, as if someone had breathed on the lens. The timestamp showed the outage had occurred while I was downstairs in his office, signing the visitor log to get back into my own building. But that wasn't the part that made my hands shake as I hung up the phone. The electronic log showed my apartment door had opened twice during those 3 minutes. 2 separate entries, 2 separate exits. The magnetic locks didn't lie. They recorded every swipe, every entry, every time someone came or went. I'd been 20 feet away from him when those doors opened, standing right there beside his desk, watching him pull up the building's access logs on his computer screen. We'd even joked about the cameras having a case of electronic hiccups. I spent the rest of the evening checking every window, every lock, every possible entry point. My hands moved methodically through the routine, but my mind kept returning to that image of the badge lying in the hallway. Perfect alignment, photo facing up, like someone had arranged it for a photograph. The building management company's office was closed, so I couldn't demand to see the full security footage until morning. But sleep felt impossible. Every small sound, the settling of floorboards, the whisper of air through heating vents, the distant closing of a car door, sent electricity through my nervous system. I sat in my living room chair, the recovered badge on the coffee table before me, and tried to construct logical explanations. Maybe I dropped it earlier in the week and simply hadn't noticed it lying there. Maybe the cleaning crew had found it and placed it outside my door. Maybe the electronic logs had glitched, showing phantom entries that never actually occurred. But logic felt thin, inadequate against the weight of what I'd experienced. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that paused directly outside my door. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the footsteps continued past my apartment and faded into silence. When I pressed my ear to the door, I heard nothing but the rush of blood in my head. The next morning brought no relief. The building manager, a woman whose voice carried the weariness of someone who dealt with tenant complaints for decades, pulled up the security footage on her office computer. The hallway cameras showed exactly what she'd described. 3 minutes of static interference, like looking through frosted glass. But before the interference began, the footage was crystal clear. And what I saw in those final clear seconds made my coffee turn to acid in my stomach. A figure had entered the frame from the stairwell, moving with purpose toward my door. The person wore dark clothing and kept their face angled away from the camera with the practiced ease of someone who understood surveillance systems. They carried something in their hand, something small and rectangular that caught the hallway's fluorescent light. The static began just as the figure reached my door. When the cameras cleared 3 minutes later, the hallway was empty, except for a small object lying on the carpet. The figure was gone, vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. But the badge remained, positioned with mathematical precision in the center of the corridor. The building manager assured me she'd file a report, increase security patrols, maybe look into upgrading the camera system. Her words felt distant, muffled, as if spoken through layers of cotton. All I could think about was that figure in the hallway, the way they'd moved with such certainty, such familiarity with the building's layout. I'd lived in that apartment for 3 years. I knew every neighbor, every delivery person, every maintenance worker who had legitimate reasons to be in that hallway. The figure on the camera didn't match any of them. That evening, I installed additional locks on my door, chain bolt, security bar, even a door alarm that would shriek if anyone tried to force entry. The hardware store clerk had raised an eyebrow at my purchases, but money talks louder than curiosity, and I'd walked out with enough security equipment to fortify a bunker. But as I sat in my apartment that second night, surrounded by my new locks and alarms, a terrible thought began to take shape. What if the person in the hallway hadn't broken in? What if they'd had a key? The electronic logs showed my door opening, but they didn't show it being forced. The magnetic lock had been disengaged properly, professionally, with the kind of access that suggested legitimate entry rather than breaking and entering. I pulled out my lease agreement and studied the fine print I'd skimmed 3 years ago. Standard clauses about maintenance access, emergency entry, right of inspection with proper notice. But buried in the legal language was a phrase that made my blood run cold. Management reserves the right to create duplicate keys for security and maintenance purposes. How many copies of my key existed? Who had access to them? The building manager certainly, the maintenance staff, the security company, maybe the corporate owners. A paper trail of access that could lead anywhere, to anyone. I called a locksmith the next morning and had every lock in my apartment changed. New keys, new codes, new everything. The locksmith was thorough, professional, and expensive. But as I watched him work, replacing cylinders and rekeying mechanisms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was closing the barn door after the horse had already escaped. The badge sat on my kitchen counter like evidence of something I couldn't quite name. I'd considered throwing it away, requesting a replacement, but something stopped me. It was the only physical proof that any of this had happened. Without it, the whole experience could be dismissed as stress-induced paranoia, urban anxiety, the kind of thing that happened to people who lived alone in big cities and watched too much true crime television. 3 days passed without incident. No mysterious footsteps, no camera malfunctions, no phantom entries in the building's electronic logs. I began to relax, to convince myself that whatever had happened was over. A one-time event, a glitch in the matrix that had corrected itself. Then I came home from work to find my door slightly ajar, not wide open, not obviously breached. Just enough of a gap to let me know that the solid wood wasn't sitting flush against the frame the way it should, the way I always made sure it did before leaving for work. My new locks were intact, no scratches, no signs of tampering. The security bar I'd installed was still in place, though it hung at an angle that suggested it had been moved and carefully repositioned. Even the door alarm was armed and functional, its red LED blinking steadily to indicate that the system was active. But the door was open. I called the police, though I wasn't sure what crime to report. Breaking and entering seemed too dramatic for an incident with no signs of forced entry and no missing property. The officers who responded were polite but clearly skeptical. They walked through my apartment, noting the expensive new locks, the multiple security devices, the general paranoia that radiated from every corner of the space. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, down to the coffee mug I'd forgotten to wash that morning, and the book I'd left open on page 247. But something felt different. The air moved wrong, circulated with patterns that seemed foreign to the space. The shadows fell at angles that didn't match my memory of how morning light filtered through the windows. Even the silence had a different quality, heavier somehow, pregnant with implications I couldn't decipher. The police filed their report and advised me to contact the building management about changing my locks again. Standard procedure, they said. though I could see in their eyes that they thought I was another urban neurotic jumping at shadows and seeing threats in empty spaces. After they left, I stood in my living room and tried to catalog what felt wrong. The coffee table was in the right place, but had it always been quite that distance from the couch? The books on my shelf maintained their familiar lean, but was the angle slightly more pronounced than before? The bathroom towel hung exactly as I always left it, but somehow that perfection felt deliberate rather than natural. It was like looking at a photograph of my apartment rather than the actual space. Everything correct in the details, but wrong in the essence. Accurate, but somehow hollow. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair with every light on, watching the door and listening to the building settle around me. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I heard the elevator ding at the end of the hall. Soft footsteps approached along the carpet, pausing at each door as if checking addresses. The footsteps stopped outside my apartment. I held my breath and strained to hear more, but silence stretched between us like a held note. No knock, no attempt to try the door, just presence on the other side of the wood, waiting. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps continued down the hall and faded away. The elevator dinged again, and then the building returned to its normal quiet. In the morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No name, no address, just a standard white envelope with something small and hard inside. My hands shook as I tore it open, and a single object fell onto my kitchen counter with a small plastic click. It was my old apartment key, the one I'd given to the locksmith when he'd changed all my locks, the one he'd supposedly destroyed as part of his standard security protocol. But here it was, returned to me like a calling card, proof that someone had been inside my apartment, had access to things they shouldn't, could come and go as they pleased despite my new locks and security systems and paranoid precautions. I called the locksmith, but his number went straight to voicemail. I called the building management office, but they claimed no knowledge of any envelope or key. I called the police, but what crime could they investigate? Someone returning my own property? The badge still sat on my kitchen counter where I'd left it, perfectly aligned with the edge of the tile. Next to it now lay the key, positioned with the same unsettling precision. Two objects that should have been separate, unconnected, but somehow formed a matched set. I picked up both items and held them in my palms, feeling their weight, their reality. Physical proof that something was happening, that I wasn't losing my mind or imagining threats in empty shadows. But proof of what, exactly? As I stood there in my kitchen, holding evidence of events I couldn't explain, a terrible possibility began to take shape. What if this wasn't about someone else having access to my apartment? What if it was about me having access to theirs? The building's electronic log showed my door opening twice during those 3 minutes of camera static. But logs could be falsified, timestamps could be altered, digital records could be manipulated by someone with the right access and technical knowledge. What if I had been in that hallway placing my own badge on the carpet with mathematical precision? What if I had entered my own apartment twice, moving through familiar space with the practiced ease of someone who belonged there? What if the figure on the security camera, face carefully angled away from surveillance, had been me? The possibility felt like ice water in my veins. I tried to remember those 3 minutes with perfect clarity, but my memory offered only fragments. Standing beside the security guard's desk, watching him type on his computer, making small talk about electronic glitches and building maintenance. But memory could lie. Memory could be edited, revised, selectively forgotten. The mind was capable of protecting itself from truths too terrible to accept, of creating false narratives to explain away actions that defied explanation. I looked at my hands holding the badge and key, and for a moment they seemed foreign, disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. Someone who could move through buildings without being seen, who could access security systems and electronic locks, who could orchestrate elaborate games of psychological manipulation, someone who might be capable of anything. The afternoon light streaming through my windows suddenly felt harsh, exposing, as if it might reveal secrets I'd hidden even from myself. I closed my eyes and tried to remember everything about that day. Every meeting, every conversation, every moment between leaving the office and climbing the stairs to find my badge lying in the hallway. But the harder I concentrated, the more the details seemed to slip away, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I am still sitting here, hours later, watching the shadows lengthen across my floor. The badge and key rest on the table before me, silent witnesses to events I can neither explain nor dismiss. Tomorrow I will have the locks changed again. I will install more cameras, more alarms, more barriers between myself and whatever truth lurks in the spaces between memory and reality. But deep in my chest, beneath the fear and paranoia and desperate need for logical explanation, a small voice whispers that no lock will keep out someone who already has the key. Someone who has always had the key. Someone who might be me. Story 5. The crash from the kitchen tore through my sleep like broken glass through silence. I jerked upright, heart hammering against my ribs, the digital clock casting its pale green judgment. 3:17 a.m. The house held its breath around me, waiting. I'd lived alone in this place for 6 months now, ever since the divorce papers were signed, and she took everything that mattered except the mortgage. The silence had become my companion, predictable and honest. But this wasn't that kind of silence. This was the pregnant pause before lightning strikes. My bare feet found the cold hardwood, and I padded toward the kitchen, each step deliberate and quiet. The dog, a golden retriever mix I'd inherited from better times, should have been barking his head off by now. Instead, I found him pressed into the corner furthest from the kitchen entrance, trembling, his usually expressive eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. When I whispered his name, he didn't even acknowledge me. The kitchen stopped me cold. The silverware drawer lay in the center of the floor, perfectly upright as if someone had simply lifted it from its track and placed it there with ceremonial precision. But it was what surrounded the drawer that made my skin crawl. Every piece of cutlery had been arranged in a perfect spiral pattern radiating outward from the drawer's base. Soup spoons, at the outermost ring, working inward through dinner spoons, teaspoons, butter knives, dinner knives, salad forks, and finally, coffee spoons at the very center. The precision was mathematical, each piece exactly the same distance from its neighbors, each handle pointing toward the same invisible focal point above the arrangement. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, my rational mind trying to process what my eyes were seeing. Had I done this? Sleepwalking, perhaps? But I'd never sleepwalked before, and the arrangement was too perfect, too deliberate. The spacing was exact to a degree that would have taken conscious effort and probably a ruler. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, I reached for the closest piece, a spatula that had somehow found its way into the spiral despite not belonging to the silverware drawer at all. The moment my fingertips brushed the rubber handle, every fork in the arrangement began to vibrate. Not violently, but with a low, almost musical frequency that seemed to resonate through the floorboards and up into my bones. The sound they made was like tuning forks struck in harmony, a chord that had no place in the natural world. I yanked my hand back, and the vibration stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the house itself was holding back something enormous. Sleep didn't come again that night. I sat in my living room chair, watching the kitchen entrance and listening for any sound that might explain what I'd witnessed. The dog eventually crept over to me, but he kept glancing toward the kitchen with the kind of wariness usually reserved for thunderstorms or vacuum cleaners. When morning finally broke through the windows, I approached the kitchen again. Everything was back in its proper place. The drawer sat innocuously in its track, the silverware nested neatly in their designated compartments. If not for the dog's continued nervous energy, I might have convinced myself it was all an elaborate dream. But dreams don't leave physical evidence, and when I opened the silverware drawer, I found something that made my blood run cold. Every piece was perfectly clean and arranged with the same mathematical precision I'd seen in the spiral. Not the casual organization I'd maintained since moving in, but something obsessively ordered. Each spoon nested against its neighbor with identical spacing. Each knife blade faced the same direction at exactly the same angle. It was the work of someone with either profound OCD or an entirely alien understanding of how objects should exist in space. The next few days passed in a haze of hypervigilance. I found myself checking and rechecking the silverware drawer multiple times a day, noting the exact position of each piece. I started taking photographs with my phone, creating a digital record of any changes. The positions never varied by even a millimeter, but other things began to happen. Books on my shelves started appearing in perfect alphabetical order, despite the fact that I'd never organized them that way. I'd lived with a comfortable chaos of volumes grouped roughly by subject, with favorite books clustered within easy reach. Now they stood in rigid formation, authors' last names marching from A to Z with military precision. When I tried to put them back the way I preferred, I'd wake up the next morning to find them reorganized again. The medicine cabinet in my bathroom underwent a similar transformation. Medications arranged by size, then by expiration date, then by frequency of use. Toiletries lined up like soldiers, labels facing forward at identical angles. Even the towels hung with geometric precision, folds aligned to create perfect symmetry. I started staying awake later, trying to catch whatever was doing this. I set up my phone to record the living room overnight, but the battery mysteriously died each time, despite being fully charged when I started recording. Motion detector lights I installed would trigger randomly throughout the house, but when I investigated, I found nothing out of place, except for some new organizational improvement that defied my understanding of when it could have occurred. The dog's behavior grew increasingly strange. He would sit in corners and stare at empty spaces for hours, occasionally whimpering as if something just beyond my perception was causing him distress. He stopped sleeping in his usual spot by my bed, instead choosing locations that offered clear sight lines to multiple rooms simultaneously. Sometimes I'd catch him tracking movement with his eyes across empty spaces, his head following the path of something invisible. Food in my refrigerator began appearing in arrangements that belonged in a museum exhibit rather than a bachelor's kitchen. Condiments organized by color and height. Fruits arranged in patterns that seemed to follow some internal logic I couldn't grasp. Even individually wrapped cheese slices were fanned out like playing cards, each wrapper facing the same direction with mathematical precision. The truly unnerving part wasn't the organization itself. It was how practical it was. Everything was easier to find, more efficiently arranged than I'd ever managed on my own. Whoever or whatever was doing this understood the space better than I did, knew exactly how I used each item and where it would be most logically placed. It was as if someone had been studying my habits for months, taking notes on my daily routines, and then improving on them with inhuman precision. I started leaving deliberate tests. A book placed horizontally on top of a vertical row, a spoon inserted backwards into the drawer, a coffee mug left in the center of the kitchen counter. Every morning, these aberrations would be corrected, incorporated into the overall system, with adjustments that somehow improved the functionality of the entire arrangement. My sleep became increasingly fragmented. I'd drift off only to wake suddenly with the feeling that someone had just stopped moving in the room next to me. The house would settle around me with small sounds, not the random creaks and pops of wood expanding and contracting, but rhythmic, purposeful sounds like footsteps that knew exactly where to place themselves to avoid making noise. I began to notice patterns in the arrangements. The silverware spiral had been just the beginning. Everything in the house was being organized according to principles I couldn't quite grasp, but was beginning to sense. There was a flow to it, a logic that connected the bathroom medicine cabinet to the kitchen spice rack to the bedroom dresser drawers. It was as if someone was turning my home into a machine, with every component optimized for maximum efficiency. The truly terrifying moment came when I realized I was starting to adapt to it. I found myself automatically returning items to their new designated places. When I reached for a spoon, my hand went directly to its precise location without conscious thought. I'd begun to appreciate the efficiency of having everything exactly where it belonged, where it could be found instantly without searching. Was I losing my mind? Had the stress of the divorce and isolation finally pushed me over some invisible edge? The alternative, that something was sharing my space and gradually reshaping it according to its own incomprehensible standards, seemed impossible. But the evidence was everywhere, documented in hundreds of photographs on my phone that showed the progression from chaos to perfect order. I called a few friends, trying to find casual ways to mention what was happening without sounding completely insane. Their responses ranged from gentle concern about my mental state to suggestions that I was probably just becoming more organized as a coping mechanism for the major life changes I'd been through. One friend even congratulated me on finally getting my act together. But friends couldn't explain the dog's behavior. They couldn't account for the fact that the arrangements appeared overnight, or that they followed principles of organization I'd never learned and couldn't replicate. They couldn't explain the feeling of being constantly watched, or the way the air in certain rooms seemed to vibrate with an almost electrical tension. I started researching online, diving deep into forums about unexplained phenomena, poltergeist activity, and psychological conditions that might cause hallucinations or false memories. The more I read, the more uncertain I became. Everything I was experiencing could be explained by stress, sleep deprivation, and the psychological impact of sudden major life changes. But it could also be something else entirely. The turning point came on a Thursday night when I decided to stay awake and watch the silverware drawer directly. I positioned myself in the kitchen with a clear view of the drawer and cabinet, armed with coffee and determination to finally see what was happening. Around 2 a.m., I began to feel drowsy despite the caffeine. My eyelids grew heavy, and I found myself fighting to stay awake. The last thing I remembered was the sound of the drawer sliding open with mechanical precision. I woke up slumped forward at the kitchen table as dawn light filtered through the windows. The drawer was closed, everything apparently normal. But when I opened it, I found something that changed everything. The silverware had been arranged in a new pattern, not the random organization I'd started with, not even the rigid precision I'd grown accustomed to, but something that looked almost like a message. The pieces formed shapes that might have been letters, or symbols, or some kind of diagram I couldn't interpret. It was clearly intentional, clearly communicative, but in a language I didn't understand. And nestled among the arranged utensils was something that definitely hadn't been there before. A single silver spoon that wasn't mine, engraved with a pattern I'd never seen. The metal was warm to the touch, as if it had just come from someone's hand. I'm writing this 3 weeks later, and the arrangements continue. They've become more elaborate, more sophisticated, as if whatever is doing this is gaining confidence or perhaps trying to communicate more complex ideas. The dog has stopped showing fear and now seems to accept the presence as part of the household routine. Sometimes I catch him sitting perfectly still, as if listening to instructions I can't hear. I've stopped trying to disrupt the patterns, partly because they always get corrected anyway, but mostly because I'm beginning to suspect that resistance might not be welcome. The entity, and I've come to think of it as an entity, seems satisfied with the current arrangement. Nothing breaks anymore. Nothing goes missing. Everything has its place, and everything stays in its place. But sometimes, late at night when the house is perfectly quiet, I can feel attention focused on me with the intensity of a magnifying glass concentrating sunlight. It's not malevolent exactly, but it's not human either. It's the attention of something that views my life as a problem to be solved, a system to be optimized, a chaos to be brought into perfect order. I wonder if I'm next. The thought doesn't terrify me as much as it should. After all, some things in my life could use better organization, and whatever is here, it seems to know exactly what it's doing. Story 6. The dust kicked up by our tires hadn't even settled when I knew we shouldn't have come here. Something about the way it hung in the air, defying the evening breeze that should have carried it away, made my skin crawl. The dirt road stretched behind us like a scar through the Texas scrubland, and ahead lay nothing but the rusted iron fence of Whispering Oaks Cemetery. Kieran had been insistent about this detour, his eyes bright with the kind of manic enthusiasm that comes after too many energy drinks and not enough sleep. We'd been driving for 12 hours straight, heading to Austin for his cousin's wedding, when he spotted the weathered sign pointing toward what the locals called the Old Boneyard. Thorne, riding shotgun, had protested weakly, but I could see the curiosity burning in his expression too. As for me, I should have put my foot down. Should have kept driving until we hit the interstate and left this godforsaken stretch of nowhere in our rearview mirror. But I didn't. The cemetery sprawled before us like a mouthful of broken teeth, headstones tilting at impossible angles, some so weathered that whatever names they once bore had been erased by decades of wind and rain. Spanish moss hung from the ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, and the air carried the smell of decay, not the sharp, immediate stench of death, but something older, more patient, something that had been fermenting in the earth for generations. I cut the engine and immediately regretted it. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the metallic ticking of the cooling car and a sound I couldn't quite identify, like whispers carried on wind that wasn't there. Kieran was already climbing out, his sneakers crunching on the gravel that had been scattered around the makeshift parking area. Thorne followed more reluctantly, adjusting his baseball cap against the setting sun. The temperature had dropped noticeably since we'd stopped, though the dashboard thermometer still read 87 degrees. I attributed it to the shade of the massive oaks, but even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't quite right. This cold felt different, wet somehow, like being wrapped in a damp sheet. "Look at this place," Kieran called out, his voice carrying an excitement that made me want to grab him by the shoulders and shake some sense into him. "Some of these graves have got to be from the 1800s, maybe earlier." I locked the car out of habit and pocketed the keys, though I couldn't imagine anyone coming out here to steal anything. The isolation was complete. We hadn't passed another car for the last 20 miles, and the nearest town was just a cluster of buildings that looked like they'd been abandoned since the oil boom went bust. The fence surrounding the cemetery was wrought iron, intricate scrollwork that had probably been beautiful once but now served as a perch for ravens that watched us with unblinking black eyes. The gate stood slightly ajar, its hinges screaming in protest as Kieran pushed it wider. The sound set my teeth on edge and sent the ravens erupting into the sky, their cries echoing off the headstones like accusations. "We shouldn't be here," I said, but the words felt hollow even to me. There was no posted sign forbidding entry, no chain on the gate. Just an overwhelming sense that we were trespassing on something sacred, something that demanded respect we weren't prepared to give. Thorne was already following Kieran into the cemetery, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I watched them weave between the graves, Kieran stopping occasionally to read inscriptions, while Thorne glanced nervously at the lengthening shadows. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky the color of dried blood, and I realized with a start that we'd be driving in full darkness soon. I took a step toward the gate and immediately felt it, a sensation like being punched in the chest by an invisible fist. The impact was so sudden and forceful that I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the uneven ground. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The air had been driven from my lungs not by physical force but by something else entirely. Something that felt like concentrated cold, like liquid nitrogen injected directly into my ribcage. The sensation lasted only seconds, but it left me gasping and shaken. I pressed my hand to my chest, expecting to find some mark, some sign of what had happened, but there was nothing, just the rapid hammering of my heart and the lingering taste of copper in my mouth. "Hey!" Thorne's voice carried across the cemetery, tinged with irritation. Something just grabbed my hat. I looked up to see him adjusting his cap, which had been knocked askew. He was looking around with the wary expression of someone who'd been startled but wasn't quite sure by what. Kieran was laughing, suggesting it had been a low-hanging branch, but I could see Thorne's skeptical expression even at this distance. The cold sensation in my chest hadn't entirely faded. If anything, it seemed to be spreading, creeping outward like ink in water. I found myself backing toward the car, my keys already in my hand before I consciously decided to retreat. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to leave, to get my friends and get back on the road while we still could. But as I reached for the door handle, I stopped. Someone had been leaning against the hood. The dusty surface of the car bore perfect impressions. 5 fingers and a thumb pressed into the accumulated grime of our long drive. The prints were large, larger than any of ours, and they were positioned as if someone had been facing the cemetery, using our car for support while they watched and waited. My mouth went dry. I called out to the others, my voice cracking embarrassingly, but they were too far away and too absorbed in their exploration to hear me. The fingerprints were fresh. The dust hadn't had time to resettle or blur the edges. But there was no one else here. There couldn't be. We'd seen no other cars, no footprints in the gravel, no sign that anyone had been in this place for months, maybe years. I walked around to the back of the car, telling myself I was being paranoid, that there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe we'd stopped somewhere earlier and I'd forgotten. Maybe one of the guys had stepped out while I was distracted and the rear window stopped my rationalizations cold. There, traced in what looked like condensation that shouldn't have existed in the dry Texas heat, was a Roman numeral, 12. The number had been drawn by a finger. I could see the deliberate strokes, the way the mysterious moisture had been pushed aside to reveal the clean glass underneath. I spun around, scanning the cemetery, the road, the endless expanse of scrubland that stretched in every direction. Nothing moved except the Spanish moss swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. The ravens had returned to their perch on the fence, and they watched me with what seemed like amusement, their heads tilted at an angle that suggested they knew something I didn't. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to document what I was seeing. The camera app opened with its familiar electronic chirp, and I raised the device to capture the fingerprints on the hood. Through the screen, I could see our car clearly, but something was wrong with the image. A green glow seemed to emanate from directly above the vehicle, casting everything in an otherworldly light that made my stomach churn. I lowered the phone and looked up with my naked eyes. The sky was empty except for a few scattered clouds and the first hint of stars. But when I raised the camera again, the green light was there, focused on our car like a spotlight from some impossible source high overhead. I took the picture anyway, my finger trembling as I pressed the shutter button. The flash seemed pathetically weak against whatever was happening here, a feeble protest against forces I couldn't begin to understand. The others were making their way back toward the gate, Kieran animated with excitement about some particularly elaborate headstone he'd discovered, Thorn looking increasingly uncomfortable as full darkness settled over the cemetery. I wanted to show them what I'd found, to demand an explanation for the impossible fingerprints and the mysterious number, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way the cold sensation in my chest had evolved into something else, a crawling awareness that we were being observed by eyes I couldn't see. Maybe it was the way my peripheral vision kept catching movement that wasn't there when I turned to look directly, or maybe it was the growing certainty that showing them the evidence would somehow make everything worse, like speaking the name of a devil you didn't want to summon. Kieran emerged from the cemetery first, practically bouncing with enthusiasm despite the unsettling atmosphere. He launched into a detailed description of the graves he'd examined, the dates he'd been able to make out, the elaborate Victorian mourning symbols carved into the older stones. His voice seemed too loud in the oppressive silence, and I found myself glancing nervously at the cemetery, as if expecting something to emerge from between the headstones to silence him. Thorn was quieter, occasionally touching his cap as if making sure it was still secure. He kept looking over his shoulder at the cemetery, and when he spoke, his voice was subdued. He mentioned feeling watched, described the sensation of something brushing against his neck when he bent to examine a particularly weathered inscription. Kieran dismissed these concerns with easy laughter, but I could see the unease in Thorn's eyes. As we prepared to leave, I made the mistake of looking back at the car one more time. The fingerprints were still there, clearly visible in the fading light, but the Roman numeral on the rear window had changed. It now read 11. I stood frozen, staring at the impossible alteration. I hadn't imagined the Turin. I had photographic evidence on my phone, but the condensation now clearly showed Gaduiers, as if someone had deliberately modified the number while we'd been talking. The change was subtle but undeniable, and it filled me with a dread so profound that I could taste it, metallic and bitter on my tongue. We drove away in silence, the cemetery disappearing behind us as we navigated the rutted dirt road back toward the highway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were carrying something with us, some invisible passenger that had climbed into the car while we weren't looking. The air conditioning was running full blast, but the interior remained cold, and every few minutes I found myself checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something sitting in the back seat. Kieran tried to maintain his earlier enthusiasm, but his comments became increasingly sporadic as the miles passed. Thorne had pulled his cap down low over his eyes and was slouched against the passenger window, but I could tell from his breathing that he wasn't asleep. We were all aware of it, the presence that seemed to fill the spaces between us, the weight of attention from something that existed just outside the range of human perception. It wasn't until we reached the interstate that I dared to check the photos on my phone. The images of the fingerprints were clear enough, though they looked somehow less convincing in digital form, as if the camera had captured only a shadow of what I'd seen with my eyes. But it was the final photograph that made my blood run cold. The green light was there, just as I'd seen it through the camera's viewfinder, but it wasn't shapeless. In the photo, the glow had form, structure. It looked almost like a figure, arms outstretched, hovering impossibly above our car. The details were vague, suggesting rather than defining, but the impression of human form was unmistakable. And in the corner of the screen, barely visible but definitely present, was a timestamp that made no sense. According to my phone, the photo had been taken at 12 a.m. exactly, midnight, but I knew with absolute certainty that it had been early evening when I'd taken it, the sun still visible on the horizon. 12, midnight. The realization hit me like another invisible punch to the chest, and I nearly swerved off the highway. The number on the rear window hadn't been random. It had been a time. And as that time approached, something had been waiting for us. Something that existed in the spaces between seconds, in the gaps where reality grew thin. Now, hours later and dozens of miles away, I keep checking the clock on the dashboard. It's 11:47 p.m., and despite the heat pouring through the vents, the car remains cold. Kieran has fallen silent, his earlier excitement replaced by a nervousness he can't quite articulate. Thorne hasn't moved from his slumped position against the window, but I can see his eyes in the side mirror, wide and alert, watching the darkness that flows past us like a living thing. I want to believe that whatever happened at the cemetery is behind us, that distance and time have severed whatever connection we might have forged with that place. But the evidence on my phone suggests otherwise, and the persistent cold in the car feels like a promise, rather than a memory. 11:51 p.m. The highway stretches endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt that leads away from what we found, but towards something else entirely. I realize now that the cemetery wasn't the destination. It was just the beginning. The Roman numerals weren't marking a moment in time, but counting down to 1. And whatever was waiting for us there isn't content to remain among the weathered headstones and forgotten graves. 11:56 p.m. In the rearview mirror, I can see something following us, keeping pace despite the fact that we're traveling at 70 miles per hour. It's not another car. The headlights are wrong, too green, too high off the ground. And sometimes, when I look directly at the mirror, there's nothing there at all. But in my peripheral vision, I can always see it, patient and persistent, matching our speed exactly. 11:59 p.m. The cold is spreading through the car now, and I can see my breath forming small clouds in the artificial light of the dashboard. Kieran has started to shiver, though he hasn't said anything. Thorne's breathing has become shallow and rapid, as if he's trying to avoid inhaling too much of whatever has invaded our space. The clock changes to 12 a.m., and for a moment that stretches like eternity. Everything stops. The engine doesn't die, but it becomes perfectly silent. The lights on the dashboard flicker and fade. Even the sensation of movement ceases, as if we're suspended in a moment between moments, trapped in the gap between IT and I. When time resumes, we're still driving, still moving toward Austin and the wedding, and the normal world that suddenly seems impossibly distant. But something fundamental has changed. The presence in the car is no longer invisible, no longer confined to peripheral vision and half-glimpsed shadows. It's sitting in the seat beside me, and when I turn to look, I see my own face staring back at me, wearing an expression of infinite patience and something that might be hunger. The other me raises a hand that isn't quite solid, fingers that leave no prints but feel real enough when they touch my shoulder. It leans closer, and when it speaks, The voice is my own, but coming from somewhere far away, like an echo from the bottom of a well. It tells me things I don't want to know, about the cemetery and what sleeps there, about the price of trespassing on ground that was never properly consecrated, about the number 13 and what it really means. But the worst part isn't what it tells me. It's the growing certainty that my friends can't see it. They're still shivering from cold they can't explain, still glancing nervously at mirrors that show them nothing unusual. To them, I'm still alone in the driver's seat, still the same person who reluctantly agreed to take a detour through a cemetery in the middle of nowhere. They don't know that I'm not driving anymore. They don't know that whatever came back with us from Whispering Oaks is learning to wear my face, my voice, my memories. They don't know that the real me is fading, becoming as insubstantial as Spanish moss in a non-existent breeze, while something else settles into my skin like it's coming home. The highway continues ahead, and we drive through the Texas night toward a wedding that will happen without me, toward lives that will continue as if nothing has changed. But in the back seat, visible only to me, sit two figures that shouldn't exist, Kieran and Thorne, but not quite, wearing faces that are almost right but not entirely. They're waiting their turn. And somewhere behind us, getting fainter with each mile but never disappearing entirely, the green light continues to follow, patient as the grave and twice as permanent. It's not chasing us anymore. It doesn't need to. We're carrying it with us now, a piece of that place that has taken root in our souls and is slowly, inevitably growing. I want to warn them, want to tell Kieran and Thorne what's happening, what's coming for them. But when I open my mouth, only my passenger's words come out, casual observations about the road ahead and how much further we have to go. The real me is trapped somewhere behind my own eyes, watching helplessly as something else pilots my body through the darkness. The worst part is that I'm not even sure when it started. Was it when I felt that first cold punch in the cemetery? When I saw the fingerprints on the car? When the number changed from Odined to Aiding? Or has it been happening all along and I'm only now becoming aware of it? The radio crackles to life without anyone touching it, tuning itself to a station that shouldn't exist, playing music that sounds like wind through headstones and the whisper of fabric on marble. In the static between songs, I can hear voices calling from somewhere far away, familiar voices pleading for help that will never come. One of them sounds like me. 12:12 a.m. The numbers on the clock continue their relentless advance, but they no longer mark the passage of time in any way I understand. Each minute feels like an hour, each hour like a lifetime, and still the highway stretches ahead into infinity. We're not driving toward Austin anymore. I realize that now. We're driving toward somewhere else entirely, somewhere that doesn't appear on any map but exists nonetheless, waiting for us with the patience of the dead. And behind us, barely visible in the rearview mirror but impossible to ignore, the green light continues to follow, growing stronger with each passing mile. Story 7. The sound cuts through sleep like a blade through flesh, a mechanical wail that shouldn't exist in my bedroom at 3 a.m. My eyes snap open to darkness so complete it feels solid, pressing against my face like a wet cloth. The toy truck's siren continues its electronic shriek from somewhere near my desk, the same piercing tone that emergency vehicles use when racing toward disaster. I fumble for the bedside lamp, knocking over a water glass in my haste. The ceramic shatters against hardwood, and suddenly the siren stops. Silence rushes back into the room with an almost audible whoosh, leaving only the distant rumble of freight trains carrying their cargo through the night. The railroad tracks run less than a quarter mile from this house, close enough that the ground trembles when the heavy engines pass. Close enough that I've grown accustomed to sleeping through their mechanical lullabies. But this wasn't a train. Light floods the room when I finally locate the switch, revealing my childhood possession sitting exactly where I'd left it. A red Peterbilt replica, no bigger than my forearm, positioned on the corner of my desk between scattered work papers and an empty coffee mug. The toy truck looks innocent now, its plastic surfaces gleaming under the overhead bulb, but something feels wrong about its placement. Had I angled it toward the bed before going to sleep? The front grille seems to be pointing directly at me, as if the inanimate object had been watching me dream. I approach the truck with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. My finger finds the small switch on its underside. The power is off. It's been off for years. The batteries died sometime during high school, and I'd never bothered replacing them. Yet somehow, impossibly, it had activated itself. The train horn echoes again in the distance, and I realize my hands are shaking. 3 years later, the new house stands 2 states away from those railroad tracks, a deliberate choice made during a particularly dark period when sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford. The real estate agent had emphasized the quiet neighborhood, the absence of commercial traffic, the way morning arrived, gentle and still. What she hadn't mentioned was how silence could become its own kind of noise, how the absence of familiar sounds could make you hyper-aware of every creak, every settling timber, every whisper of wind through inadequately sealed windows. Tonight I'm working late again, hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table while spreadsheets blur together on the screen. The deadline approaches like an incoming storm, and I've been surviving on coffee and determination for the better part of a week. My eyes burn from screen glare, and my neck aches from hours spent in the same position. But the work demands completion. The house around me breathes with the rhythm of old construction, wooden bones expanding and contracting with temperature changes, pipes settling into their fixtures, the occasional pop of cooling heating ducts. These sounds have become comforting in their predictability, a domestic symphony that signals safety and isolation. Then I hear the footsteps. They begin somewhere above my head, in the region of the house I rarely visit. The attic access lies at the top of a narrow staircase that climbs from the second-floor hallway. The steps are deliberate and measured, the kind of careful footfalls someone makes when trying not to disturb others. But there are no others. I live alone, and the house has been locked since evening. Thud, thud, thud. Each impact sends a small vibration through the ceiling above me, causing the hanging light fixture to sway almost imperceptibly. I stop typing and tilt my head upward, straining to catch every nuance of sound. The footsteps continue their steady progression across the attic floor, moving from one end of the house toward the other in a straight line that suggests purposeful navigation rather than random settling. My rational mind catalogs possible explanations. Raccoons in the walls, mice amplified by the hollow spaces between floors, thermal expansion causing loose boards to shift. But none of these explanations account for the rhythmic regularity of the sounds, the human-like cadence that speaks of bipedal movement and conscious intent. The footsteps stop directly overhead. Silence returns with uncomfortable weight, pressing down from above like the held breath of a massive creature. I remain frozen at the kitchen table, laptop screen casting blue light across my face, waiting for the next sound that will either confirm my fears or dismiss them as products of an overworked imagination. A door creaks open somewhere above, the distinctive groan of hinges that haven't been oiled in months. I know that sound intimately because I've been meaning to fix it since moving in. The attic access panel has warped slightly in its frame, creating friction that announces every opening with a prolonged squeal of protest. But I didn't open that door. More footsteps, these ones muffled and distant, as if the walker has moved beyond the main attic space into some deeper recess of the house's upper reaches. The sounds fade gradually, growing softer and more indefinite, until they disappear entirely into the building's ambient noise. I wait. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Nothing descends. No footsteps return the way they came. No door closes with that familiar creak. The attic has apparently swallowed whatever was moving through it, leaving me alone with questions and the growing certainty that something fundamental has shifted in my understanding of this house. My hands shake as I save my work and close the laptop. The smart thing would be to ignore what I've heard, to chalk it up to stress and sleep deprivation and return to my normal evening routine. Instead, I find myself climbing the stairs toward the second floor, phone in hand with its camera app already active. The hallway stretches before me, lit by a single overhead bulb that throws harsh shadows into the corners. The attic access panel hangs slightly open, just enough to reveal a rectangle of impenetrable darkness beyond its frame. I don't remember leaving it that way, but memory becomes unreliable when filtered through exhaustion and mounting paranoia. I film myself reaching for the cord that will lower the folding ladder, hoping that the act of documentation will provide some measure of protection, or at least evidence of what happens next. The metal steps unfold with mechanical precision, their joints clicking into place with sounds that seem unnaturally loud in the confined space. Cool air flows down from the opening above, carrying scents of dust and old insulation and something else. Something organic and slightly sweet that I can't identify. I climb slowly, phone held ahead of me like a talisman, its LED light cutting a narrow beam through the attic's darkness. The space above reveals itself in fragments. Cardboard boxes stacked against the far wall, the silver bulk of air conditioning ducts snaking through the rafters, pink insulation batting rolled between floor joists. Everything appears normal and undisturbed, exactly as I'd left it during my last visit months ago. But the light bulb hanging from the central rafter sways gently back and forth, its motion too regular and sustained to be caused by air currents from below. The bulb traces a slow pendulum arc through the stale air, casting moving shadows that dance across the stored boxes and exposed framing. There's no wind up here. The attic has no windows, no vents that could channel exterior air into this space. The building's HVAC system runs through sealed ducts that wouldn't create the kind of airflow needed to move a hanging fixture, yet the bulb continues its rhythmic swing, as if something had recently passed beneath it, something large enough to disturb the air with its movement. I film the swaying light, watching through my phone's screen as the shadows shift and merge in hypnotic patterns. The device's timestamp reads 2:47 a.m., and I realize I've been standing in this attic for nearly 10 minutes without moving, transfixed by the impossible motion of an inanimate object. The phone vibrates in my hand. An incoming call interrupts my recording, the screen shifting to display an unknown number with an area code I don't recognize. But there's something familiar about the contact information, something that triggers a memory I can't quite access. I decline the call and wait for the screen to return to camera mode, but the phone vibrates again immediately. Another call from the same number. This time I answer, raising the device to my ear while keeping my eyes fixed on the still swaying light bulb. Static fills the connection. Not the clean white noise of a bad cellular signal, but something more complex and layered, like multiple radio frequencies bleeding together into electronic chaos. Through the static, I hear my own voice. The words are distant and distorted, filtered through what sounds like multiple layers of interference, but unmistakably mine. I'm having a conversation with someone, discussing work deadlines and weekend plans and other mundane details of daily life. But I'm not speaking now. My mouth remains closed while my recorded voice continues its phantom dialogue through the phone's speaker. The static intensifies, and beneath it, I catch fragments of another sound. The electronic wail of a toy truck's siren, fading in and out of the audio mix like a radio station that can't quite lock onto its frequency. I end the call and check the phone's recent activity, searching for any explanation of what I've just experienced. The call log shows the incoming number, but when I try to call it back, I receive an automated message stating that the number is not in service. The light bulb has stopped swaying. The call haunts me through the following days. I research the area code, discovering it belongs to a region I lived in years ago. The town where I'd grown up, where I'd kept that red toy truck on my bedroom desk. The realization creates a cold hollow in my stomach, a sensation that spreads outward until my entire body feels numb and disconnected. I start making calls of my own, reaching out to old friends and family members who might explain the connection. Most of my inquiries lead nowhere. Childhood acquaintances who've moved on with their lives, relatives who remember the toy truck, but have no knowledge of mysterious phone calls or unexplained sounds in attics. But one conversation yields unexpected information. My college roommate remembers the truck clearly. He recalls me giving it to him during our senior year, along with several boxes of childhood possessions I'd been planning to discard. He'd kept the toy as a nostalgic reminder of our friendship, displaying it on a shelf in his apartment, and later in the house he'd bought after graduation. The truck had been working perfectly until recently. He'd discovered it one morning with fresh batteries installed, batteries he didn't remember purchasing or inserting. The device had begun activating randomly, its siren sounding at all hours without apparent cause. He'd removed the batteries multiple times, but they kept reappearing, always fully charged, always ready to power the truck's increasingly frequent outbursts. The final incident had occurred 3 days ago. He'd been video calling his mother when the truck interrupted by somehow joining the conversation. His mother had seen it too. A brief glimpse of a red toy vehicle positioned on a desk, surrounded by what looked like outdated wallpaper and furniture. The image had lasted only a few seconds before the call returned to normal, but both he and his mother were certain of what they'd witnessed. He'd thrown the truck away the next morning. I drive to my old hometown the following weekend, compelled by a need to understand that overrides rational judgment. The house where I'd grown up has new owners now, but they're kind enough to let me examine my former bedroom when I explain my situation in carefully edited terms. The room has been converted into a home office, its walls painted neutral beige and decorated with generic artwork. But the desk remains in the same position where I'd kept my childhood toys, positioned beneath a window that overlooks the backyard, and beyond that, the railroad tracks that still carry freight through the night. I ask about strange sounds, unexplained phone calls, anything that might validate my growing certainty that something follows me across distances and years like a signal seeking its proper receiver. The new owners exchange glances but remain polite, mentioning only that they sometimes hear sirens in the distance. Emergency vehicles racing along the highway, trains announcing their passage, the ordinary sounds of a world in constant motion. That night, in my hotel room 10 miles from the house, my phone rings at 3 a.m. The number is different this time, but when I answer, I hear the same static-filled conversation between myself and some unknown participant. The discussion has evolved, become more specific. We're talking about the attic, about footsteps and swaying lights, and the impossibility of objects that activate themselves. But I've never had this conversation with anyone. The static clears for a moment, and I hear my own voice asking a question that makes my blood freeze. What happens when you realize you're the one making the calls? The line goes dead. I check my phone's outgoing call log and find the entry I somehow knew would be there. A call made to the same number I just answered, placed at exactly 3 a.m. According to my phone's records, I had initiated the conversation I'd just received. The rational explanations crumble one by one as I drive home the next morning. Equipment malfunction, sleep deprivation, stress-induced hallucinations. None of these theories adequately explain the accumulating evidence of something that exists beyond the boundaries of normal experience. The toy truck has become a focal point, a conduit for communications that bridge gaps between past and present, between one location and another, between different versions of myself, separated by time and distance. I arrive home to find my attic access panel hanging open again, though I'm certain I'd secured it before leaving for the weekend. Cool air flows down from the dark space above, carrying that same organic sweetness I'd noticed before, a scent that reminds me of childhood summers and birthday parties, and simpler times when toys stayed where you put them, and phones only rang when someone wanted to talk. The folding ladder extends with familiar mechanical sounds, and I climb toward the attic's darkness with my phone recording everything. The light bulb hangs motionless now, but something else has changed. A cardboard box sits in the center of the floor, positioned directly beneath the fixture where no box had been before. Inside I find my old toy truck. It's exactly as I remember it. Red paint slightly faded from years of handling, tiny details molded into the plastic cab and trailer, the small switch on its underside that controls the electronic siren, but the batteries are new, their contacts bright and uncorroded, their power indicator showing full charge. As I lift the truck from the box, it activates. The siren sounds in my hands, its electronic wail filling the confined attic space with mechanical alarm. But this time, I hear something else beneath the noise, a voice calling my name from somewhere far away, distorted by static and distance but unmistakably real. It's my own voice, calling back to me across years and miles and the impossible spaces between what is and what should be. The truck stops wailing, but I can still hear my voice calling, fainter now but persistent, echoing from directions that don't exist in any geography I understand. I'm calling to myself from the past, from the future, from parallel moments where choices were made differently and outcomes shifted along paths I'll never walk. I set the truck down carefully and back toward the ladder. But my phone vibrates again. Another incoming call. Another number I don't recognize. When I answer, I hear my voice having this exact conversation, discussing the attic, the truck, the impossibility of receiving calls from myself. But I'm not speaking. My mouth is closed while my recorded voice describes actions I'm performing in real time, as if someone is watching me from a place outside of linear time and reporting my movements to a version of myself that exists somewhere else in the labyrinth of possibility. The call ends, and I climb down from the attic with questions that have no answers and evidence that makes no sense. The toy truck remains above, silent now, but somehow still transmitting, still bridging gaps between different versions of my life like a radio tuned to frequencies that shouldn't exist. I close the access panel and try to return to normal routines, but normality has become a luxury I can no longer afford. The truck will activate again. Tonight, next week, in months or years when I've almost convinced myself that none of this really happened. It will call out across the impossible distances that separate different moments of the same life, connecting past to present to future, in ways that defy every rule I thought I understood. And somewhere in the static between one call and the next, I'll hear my own voice asking the question that has no answer. What happens when you realize you're both the signal and the receiver, both the caller and the called, both the observer and the observed in a conversation that never ends? The phone sits silent on my kitchen table, but I know it will ring again. It always does. And when it does, I'll answer. Because somewhere across the years and miles and impossible spaces between different versions of myself, someone is waiting to hear what I have to say about the truck that follows me home. Story 8. The recording plays again. I didn't press anything. The laptop sits 3 feet away on my kitchen counter, its screen dark, yet that familiar hiss of static emerges from its speakers like a serpent's whisper. Always the same moment, 47 seconds in, where the audio grows thick and syrupy, where that voice drifts up from whatever depths we found in that Scottish manor. May I come in? The words hang in my apartment's stale air, soft as velvet, patient as death. It's been 3 weeks since we returned from the Highlands, 3 weeks since what was supposed to be a simple getaway with college friends turned into something I can't quite name. Even now as I write this, I'm not entirely sure what happened up there, but the evidence accumulates like snow against my windows, small, persistent intrusions that make me question whether I brought something back with me, or whether something simply followed me home. The manor had been a last-minute find, one of those too-good-to-be-true rental properties that appear when your original plans fall through. Our intended destination, a modern cabin near Loch Ness, had suffered what the owner called structural issues, leaving 4 of us scrambling for alternatives during what was meant to be our final reunion before adult responsibilities scattered us across different continents. The estate agent's photos showed weathered stone walls and Gothic windows, the kind of romantic decay that looks charming in filtered sunlight. What they didn't capture was the weight of the place, how it seemed to press down on your shoulders the moment you stepped from the car. The building squatted against the hillside like something that had grown from the earth itself, its dark windows reflecting nothing but gray sky. Our guide, a thin man whose accent made every word sound like an apology, led us through rooms that smelled of damp wool and something sharper underneath, something chemical and old. He pointed out the dining hall's original fireplace, the library's hand-carved shelves, the way afternoon light slanted through the solar's ancient glass. His enthusiasm felt rehearsed, as if he'd given this tour countless times to renters who never quite understood what they were paying for. The bedrooms were assigned by lottery. I drew the short straw. The room on the 4th floor had been servants' quarters once, the guide explained, back when the manor required a staff of 30 to maintain its operations. The ceiling slanted sharply, forcing anyone over 6 feet to duck near the window, and the floorboards creaked with the particular groan of wood that has spent centuries expanding and contracting with Highland weather. But it was the wall that caught my attention. Directly across from the narrow bed, someone had painted a panel in bright pink, the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that belongs in a child's bedroom. not a Scottish manor that had stood since the 1600s. The paint looked fresh, almost wet in the room's dim light, and it covered what appeared to be some kind of opening in the stone wall. You could see the edges where the original architecture had been modified, where stones had been removed or repositioned to create a gap that the pink panel now concealed. When I asked about it during dinner, the guide's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He glanced toward the stairs leading to the upper floors, then back at his plate of lamb and potatoes. "Just decoration," he said, resuming his meal. "Previous owners thought it might brighten the space." The explanation felt insufficient, but I didn't press. My friends were already deep into their second bottle of wine, sharing stories about jobs and relationships, and the general anxiety of being 26 in a world that seemed designed for people who had their shit together. The manor's peculiarities seemed less important than maintaining the illusion that we were still the same people who had shared a dorm floor 5 years earlier. But I found myself thinking about that panel as I lay in the narrow bed that night, listening to Highland wind rattle the windows. The pink seemed to glow in the darkness, as if lit from within, and I could swear I heard something moving behind the wall. Not mice or settling timber, but something that sounded almost like breathing. I told myself it was the wine. I told myself it was the unfamiliar surroundings, the way old buildings seem to whisper in the dark. I told myself a lot of things that night, but none of them explained why I woke at 3 in the morning to find the panel slightly ajar, revealing a gap no wider than my thumb. The smell hit me first, chalk dust and brine, as if someone had ground up seashells and mixed them with classroom erasers. It was coming from behind the panel, drifting through that narrow opening like an invitation. I should have woken my friends. I should have left it alone. Instead, I found myself kneeling beside the wall, pressing my face close to that gap and breathing in air that tasted of salt and abandonment. That's when I heard it. Not the voice. Not yet. But something moving in the space beyond. A rustling, like fabric against stone, accompanied by the softest whisper of sound that might have been wind, or might have been words in a language I didn't recognize. I pulled the panel wider. The opening revealed a narrow duct that disappeared into the wall's depths, perfectly round and smooth as if worn by centuries of use. The chalk and seaweed smell grew stronger, and I realized I was looking at some kind of speaking tube, the sort Victorian houses used to connect different floors, allowing servants to communicate without leaving their posts. But this one felt different, older, as if it had been carved before such conveniences became fashionable. My phone's flashlight revealed stone walls that curved away into darkness, descending at a gentle angle that suggested the tube ran through the manor's entire structure. When I called out a tentative, "Hello," my voice echoed strangely, not with the sharp bounce of enclosed spaces, but with something softer, as if the sound were being absorbed and transformed. That's when my friend knocked on the door, asking if I was all right. I'd apparently been making noise, moving furniture, he said, though I'd done nothing but kneel beside the wall. I closed the panel quickly, mumbling something about restless sleep, and spent the remainder of the night sitting in the room's only chair, watching that pink square and trying to convince myself I hadn't heard footsteps in the walls. The next morning brought rational explanations. The panel was clearly some kind of architectural modification, probably installed to cover an old servant's passage or ventilation system. The smell could be explained by Highland moisture and the particular minerals in Scottish stone. The sounds were nothing more than wind moving through the building's ancient bones. But I couldn't stop thinking about that duct, about the way my voice had seemed to travel much farther than the walls should have allowed. During our final day at the manor, while my friends explored the grounds and took photographs of Highland sheep, I returned to the room with my laptop and a small digital recorder. I opened the panel again, more carefully this time, and slipped the recorder into the duct as far as my arm could reach. The device's red light blinked once before disappearing into the darkness, and I settled back to wait. 43 minutes later, I retrieved it. The recorder warmed despite the duct's evident chill. The first 46 seconds contained exactly what I expected. The hiss of empty space, the subtle creaks of an old building, the distant sound of my friends' voices drifting up from the floors below. But at 47 seconds, something changed. The ambient noise grew thick and muffled. as if the recorder had suddenly been submerged in honey, and underneath that syrupy static came the voice. Low, patient, with an accent I couldn't place. "May I come in?" I played it back 3 times before my hands started shaking. The voice wasn't speaking English, at least not any English I recognized, but somehow I understood the words perfectly, as if they'd been translated directly into my thoughts. And there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. The voice sounded expectant, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment, as if the recorder's presence had been anticipated. I packed immediately. The flight home felt endless. During the layover in London, I found myself checking the laptop's audio files compulsively, confirming that the recording was still there, still real. My friends thought I was being dramatic. Typical you, finding mystery where there's just old plumbing. But they hadn't heard what I'd heard. They hadn't felt the way that voice seemed to reach through the speakers and touch something deep in their chest. Back in my apartment in Portland, I tried to forget about the manor. I returned to work, threw myself into projects that required complete focus, met friends for drinks, and pretended nothing had changed. But the recording had become an itch I couldn't stop scratching. I found myself playing it at random moments, while cooking dinner, while checking email, while lying in bed and staring at the ceiling. Always the same 47 seconds. Always the same question. "May I come in?" And always without fail, I felt compelled to answer, yes. But I never said it out loud. Something told me that would be a mistake. The first sign that my apartment had become something other than home appeared on a Tuesday morning. I'd woken naturally, no alarm, and stumbled to the kitchen to start coffee. That's when I noticed my living room curtains, heavy burgundy panels I'd inherited from the previous tenant and never bothered to replace, hanging in perfect mathematical pleats. Not the casual folds of fabric that had been drawn closed the night before, but precise accordion pleats, each fold exactly the same width, each crease sharp enough to cut paper. They looked like something you'd see in a high-end hotel, the work of professional housekeeping staff trained to make everything appear flawlessly arranged. I live alone. I had closed those curtains haphazardly, the way I always do, pulling them shut with one hand while balancing a glass of wine in the other. There was no explanation for their current state except that someone had entered my apartment during the night and spent considerable time arranging them with mathematical precision. But the locks were still engaged. The security chain was still in place. The windows were still latched from the inside. I told myself it was sleepwalking. People did strange things in their sleep, rearranged furniture, prepared elaborate meals, even held conversations. Maybe I'd developed some kind of nocturnal compulsion for order, a stress response to the unsettling experience in Scotland. But sleepwalkers don't typically possess the skill to create perfect pleats in heavy fabric. And sleepwalkers don't usually work with such obvious intention, such deliberate artistry. The kitchen bell started 3 days later. It was an old-fashioned thing, probably installed in the 1950s when the apartment building was constructed. A simple brass dome connected to the wall by a black cord that had been cut and capped decades ago. The property manager had mentioned it during my lease signing, explaining that it was a relic from when tenants used bells to summon building maintenance. Non-functional, he'd assured me, just part of the apartment's vintage charm. But at 5:11 a.m. on Friday morning, it rang. Not the sharp, insistent clang you'd expect from a mechanical bell, but a soft, almost musical chime that seemed to hang in the air long after the brass had stopped vibrating. I lay in bed listening to that impossible sound, my heart hammering against my ribs, until silence returned and I could convince myself I'd dreamed it. The next morning, same time, same gentle ring. And the next, I called the property manager, who confirmed what I already knew. The bell hadn't been connected to anything in over 30 years. He offered to have maintenance remove it entirely, but something stopped me from agreeing. The bell felt important somehow, like a clock marking time in some larger mechanism I couldn't yet understand. Besides, I was starting to suspect that removing it wouldn't solve the problem. Whatever was happening in my apartment wasn't bound by conventional rules about electrical circuits or mechanical connections. The curtains had taught me that. It was during the second week of daily bell ringing that the laptop started playing the recording on its own. I'd wake to find it open on my kitchen counter, its screen glowing in the pre-dawn darkness, speakers hissing with that familiar static. Always the same moment. 47 seconds in, where reality became negotiable, and that patient voice asked its eternal question. May I come in? The first few times I assumed I'd accidentally triggered the playback in my sleep. Laptops were finicky things, and mine was old enough to have developed various electronic quirks. But I started closing it completely before bed, unplugging it, even storing it in my bedroom closet with the lid latched shut. It didn't matter. Every morning at 5:11 the bell would ring, and by the time I reached the kitchen the laptop would be open and playing, positioned precisely in the center of the counter with its screen angled toward the hallway as if waiting for my arrival. The recording never progressed beyond that single question. It would play the first 47 seconds, pause at the voice, then loop back to the beginning. Sometimes I'd find it had been running for hours, the same snippet of Scottish static cycling endlessly through my apartment's increasingly strange atmosphere. I started leaving notes for myself before bed, little reminders about where I'd placed things and how I'd arranged them. The curtains continued their nightly transformation into geometric perfection. Other objects began joining their dance. Books aligned with mathematical precision on shelves, kitchen utensils arranged in patterns that seemed almost ceremonial, bathroom towels folded into shapes that belonged in expensive hotels. But it was the morning I found my coffee mug sitting in the exact center of the dining table, filled with steaming liquid I hadn't prepared, that I finally understood something fundamental about my situation. I wasn't alone anymore. The coffee was perfect. The right temperature, the right strength, even the right amount of cream. It tasted like something I would have made for myself, if I were the kind of person who could remember making coffee and then forget I'd done it. But I distinctly remembered going to bed thirsty, planning to brew a pot first thing in the morning. Someone else had made that coffee. Someone who knew exactly how I liked it. Someone who had been watching me long enough to learn my preferences. I called in sick to work and spent the day installing security cameras, small wireless units that could record to cloud storage and send alerts to my phone. If something was moving through my apartment at night, rearranging my belongings and brewing perfect coffee, I was going to capture evidence. The cameras revealed nothing. No mysterious figures gliding through my rooms. No shadowy presences adjusting curtains or operating kitchen appliances. The footage showed only empty spaces, normal rooms where nothing extraordinary occurred. But the next morning brought the same impossible results. Pleated curtains, positioned objects, fresh coffee that tasted like love and patience. It was as if whatever shared my space existed in the gaps between frames, in the spaces where digital eyes couldn't follow. I started staying awake. At first, it was just a matter of drinking extra coffee and setting multiple alarms. If something was visiting my apartment during the night, I reasoned, then remaining conscious would either reveal the visitor or prevent their activities entirely. Simple logic for a situation that had abandoned logic weeks ago. But staying awake in a haunted space, and I was beginning to accept that haunted was the most accurate description available, proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. The apartment felt different in the dark hours, heavier somehow, as if the air itself had thickened. Sounds that seemed perfectly normal during daylight hours, the refrigerator's hum, the building's settling creaks, the distant murmur of traffic, took on ominous weight between midnight and dawn. And always, threading through the familiar nocturnal symphony, I could hear something else. A soft rustling that seemed to come from inside the walls, accompanied by the faintest whisper of that chalk and seaweed smell I'd first encountered in Scotland. On the third night of my vigil, sitting in my living room with every light burning and my laptop playing the cursed recording on repeat, I finally saw movement. Not a figure exactly, but a shifting in the air near the kitchen doorway. A distortion that reminded me of heat waves rising from summer asphalt, but colder somehow, more deliberate. It lasted only seconds, just long enough for me to register that something had passed between me and the wall, and then it was gone. But the curtains began their transformation immediately afterward, folding themselves into those impossible pleats while I watched, the heavy fabric moving with fluid grace as if guided by invisible hands that knew exactly how each crease should fall. I tried to intervene, reaching for the curtains to stop their metamorphosis, but my hands passed through the fabric without resistance. Not literally. I could feel the material, could touch its surface, but I couldn't affect its movement. It was as if the curtains existed in two states simultaneously, present enough to touch, but somehow beyond my ability to influence. The coffee mug appeared next, materializing on the dining table like something conjured from the air itself. One moment the table was empty. The next, it held a steaming cup of perfectly prepared coffee, arranged just as I would have placed it if I'd been the one doing the arranging. That's when I understood what I was witnessing wasn't random supernatural activity, it was mimicry. Something was learning my habits, my preferences, my rituals, and reproducing them with uncanny accuracy. Like a very attentive guest trying to blend seamlessly into their host's routine. Like something asking permission to share my space. "May I come in?" The laptop speakers hissed the familiar question, and for the first time since returning from Scotland, I felt compelled to answer honestly. "You're already here," I said to the empty apartment. The recording stopped mid-loop. The silence that followed was profound, as if the entire building had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. Even the ambient sounds that usually filled nighttime hours, the refrigerators cycling, the heating system's whispers, the distant hum of city life, had ceased entirely. Then, from somewhere deep within my apartment's walls, came the softest sound of satisfaction. A sigh that might have been wind through ancient stone, or might have been something much older, finally receiving the acknowledgement it had been seeking. The curtains finished their pleating with a flourish that seemed almost ceremonial. I write this now as dawn approaches, the familiar brass bell preparing to mark another morning with its impossible chime. The laptop sits open beside me, its screen reflecting my haggard face and the evidence of sleepless nights. The recording waits in its digital memory, 47 seconds of Scottish static and that patient, eternal question. But I understand now that the question was never really a request for entry. It was a request for recognition, for acknowledgement of a presence that had already established itself in the spaces between my certainty and doubt. Something had followed me home from that Highland manor, or perhaps I'd carried it back myself, embedded in those 47 seconds of captured sound like a seed waiting for proper soil. The coffee sits cooling on my table, prepared by hands I'll never see for a guest who doesn't require invitation so much as acceptance. My curtains hang in their perfect pleats, arranged by an aesthete whose standards exceed my own. The bell marks time for a household that includes members I'm only beginning to perceive. I should be terrified. Any rational person would pack their belongings and flee to somewhere safe, somewhere free from impossible domestic intrusions and questions that echo from Scottish stone. But rationality feels inadequate now, like trying to measure an ocean with a teaspoon. Besides, I'm starting to appreciate the company. The coffee really is perfect. The curtains are beautiful in their geometric precision, and there's something comforting about sharing space with a presence that asks permission rather than simply taking what it wants. In a world where so much is taken without consent, where privacy feels increasingly impossible, I find myself oddly grateful for a roommate with such impeccable manners, even if I'm not entirely sure it's real. Even if I'm not entirely sure I am anymore. The bell chimes 5:11, and somewhere in my walls, something rustles like fabric against stone. I close the laptop, finish my impossible coffee, and prepare for another day of pretending normalcy, while sharing my life with questions I can't answer. After all, it asks so politely. Story 9. The first night, I thought it was a malfunction. The red digits on my nightstand clock burned through the darkness. 3 a.m. The shrill electronic beeping pierced through my apartment like fingernails on glass, jolting me from deep sleep with the violence of a car crash. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled for the device, fingers clumsy with sleep and adrenaline. No alarm set. The display showed nothing but the time, pulsing like a digital heartbeat in the suffocating blackness of my bedroom. I yanked the cord from the wall, and silence returned like a held breath finally released. The sudden quiet felt heavier than the noise had been, pressing against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. Outside, the city hummed its constant midnight lullaby. Distant traffic, the occasional siren, the mechanical whisper of air conditioning units. Normal sounds, safe sounds. But something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like walking into a room and sensing someone had just left it. The second night, 4:06 a.m. This time I was already half awake, tossing in the grip of restless dreams when the alarm shrieked to life. The sound seemed louder now, more urgent, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness with surgical precision. I sat up immediately, every nerve ending suddenly alert, watching those red numbers mock me from across the room. Again, no timer, no explanation. Just that relentless electronic scream demanding my attention. I unplugged it again, but this time I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the silent clock while shadows crawled across my walls like living things. The heating system kicked on with a mechanical groan that made me flinch, and I realized my hands were shaking. When I plugged the clock back in before leaving for work, it resumed its normal function as if nothing had happened. The time was correct. The date was accurate. Everything appeared perfectly normal in the harsh light of morning, but normal was becoming a concept I trusted less with each passing hour. The third night brought 5:12 a.m. I was ready this time, lying in bed with my eyes fixed on the clock face, watching the minutes crawl toward what I somehow knew was coming. The anticipation was worse than the surprise had been. A slow building pressure behind my eyes, a metallic taste coating my tongue like fear made manifest. When the alarm erupted into the darkness, I didn't move to stop it immediately. Instead, I let it wail while I studied the pattern, searching for meaning in those numbers. 3:00, 4:06, 5:12, 66-minute intervals. Why 66? What significance could that possibly hold? The sound seemed to fill every corner of my apartment, seeping through walls and floorboards, until I could feel it vibrating in my bones. My upstairs neighbors stomped across their floor in irritation, and somewhere down the hall, a dog began to howl in response. That's when I understood, not the mechanics of it. I couldn't explain how a digital clock could activate without being programmed, or why it chose those specific times. But I understood its purpose with a clarity that bypassed rational thought entirely. This wasn't random. This wasn't malfunction. This was communication. I sat up in bed, my voice cracking as I spoke to the empty room. I understand. The alarm stopped mid-note, cutting off so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical blow. The red digits continued their patient countdown, but the aggressive urgency was gone, replaced by something that felt almost satisfied. Sleep eluded me for the rest of that night. I sat by my window, watching the sky slowly lighten from black to deep purple to pale gray, wondering what I had just agreed to. The fourth night, nothing happened. I lay awake until sunrise, waiting for sounds that never came. The clock maintained its vigil silently, counting down the hours with mechanical indifference, but the absence of the alarm felt more ominous than its presence had been, like the held breath before a scream. Weeks passed. The clock behaved normally, and I began to convince myself I had imagined the entire episode. Stress, perhaps. Too much caffeine. Not enough sleep. The mind was capable of remarkable self-deception when pushed beyond its limits, and I had been working long hours, dealing with difficult clients, carrying the weight of adult responsibilities that sometimes felt heavier than my shoulders could bear. But the memory of that understanding lingered like smoke in a closed room, impossible to grasp directly, yet unmistakably present. Then came the night that changed everything. I was deep in REM sleep when my phone erupted into chaos on my nightstand. Not the clock this time, my actual cell phone, screaming with an alarm I had never set, at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. The sound was different, more urgent, more desperate than any ringtone in my arsenal. Confusion clouded my thoughts as I grabbed the device, but the alarm wouldn't stop. The screen showed nothing but the time and a notification I couldn't dismiss. My thumb jabbed frantically at the display, but the sound continued, growing louder, more insistent. That's when I felt it. A pulling sensation, like invisible hands tugging at my consciousness. Not a physical force, but something deeper. an imperative that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to some primitive part of my brain that still remembered how to listen to warnings. Without understanding why, I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The hallway was empty, fluorescent lights humming their eternal tune overhead. My bare feet slapped against the cold tile as I moved toward the elevator, guided by nothing but instinct and the persistent shrieking of my phone. The building felt different at this hour, not just quiet, but hollow, like a shell waiting to be filled with something unpleasant. The elevator descended with mechanical patience while my phone continued its electronic tantrum. By the time I reached the ground floor, my heart was racing in time with the alarm, adrenaline flooding my system like liquid electricity. The garage level was supposed to be quiet at this hour, a concrete tomb filled with sleeping cars and the distant hum of ventilation systems. Instead, I heard the rumble of an engine echoing off concrete walls, bouncing and amplifying until it sounded like thunder trapped underground. I found him slumped over the steering wheel of his sedan, the car running in the closed garage, carbon monoxide pooling in the stagnant air like an invisible predator. Jenkins from 4B, a man I'd exchanged perhaps 20 words with in 3 years of shared residence. His face was pale, lips tinged with an unhealthy blue, but his chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths. The garage door had malfunctioned, trapping him inside with his remote start car after what must have been a late night at work. Simple mechanical failure, the kind of mundane disaster that claimed lives every year through nothing more sinister than bad timing and worse luck. But my phone had known. Somehow, impossibly, it had known. I dragged him from the car, called 911, waited for paramedics who arrived with sirens that seemed almost gentle compared to the alarm that had summoned me. Jenkins recovered fully after a night in the hospital, grateful and confused about how I had found him at just the right moment. I never told him about the phone. How could I? How do you explain that your electronic devices had become early warning systems for disasters you couldn't possibly predict? Instead, I went home and programmed a daily alarm for 3:00 a.m., not because I believed in supernatural intervention or technological possession, but because I had learned to recognize when the universe was trying to tell me something important. The official designation read, routine check, but I knew what it really was. It was acceptance. Acknowledgement that some forms of knowledge existed outside the boundaries of rational explanation, and that fighting them was less productive than learning to listen. The alarm has gone off 6 times since then. Each time, I've found something. A gas leak in the building's basement that could have killed dozens. A homeless man collapsed behind the dumpster during a winter freeze. A water main break that would have flooded the lower levels before anyone noticed. Small disasters, the kind that happen every day in a city of millions. Except now I seem to be receiving advance notice through channels I couldn't begin to understand. I've stopped questioning the mechanism, whether it's some kind of quantum entanglement between electronic devices and impending catastrophe, or simply my subconscious mind processing sensory data in ways my conscious thoughts couldn't access. The result remained the same. People lived who might otherwise have died, and I slept a little less soundly knowing that something, or someone, was watching. The clock sits on my nightstand now, red digits counting down the hours with mechanical precision. During the day, it's just another household appliance, as mundane as the toaster or the coffee maker. But at night, in the darkness when the boundary between possible and impossible grows thin, I find myself watching those numbers with a mixture of anticipation and dread, because I know it's watching me back. Sometimes, in the deep hours when sleep hovers just beyond reach, I catch myself wondering what would happen if I ignored the next alarm. If I simply rolled over, pulled the pillow over my head, and pretended I hadn't heard anything. Would someone die because I chose comfort over responsibility? Would the devices give up on me, moving on to someone else more willing to serve as their human agent? Or would they find other ways to get my attention, methods less gentle than electronic screaming in the night? I don't want to find out. The rational part of my mind insists this is all elaborate coincidence. Pattern recognition gone haywire. A brain desperate to find meaning in random events, weaving narratives from statistical noise because chaos is more terrifying than conspiracy. Perhaps I'm simply more observant now, more attuned to the subtle signs that precede disaster. Maybe the alarms are just my subconscious finally learning to speak loud enough to wake the rest of me. But rationality feels like a luxury I can no longer afford. Because tonight, the clock's display has been flickering, not regularly, not in any pattern I can discern, but random stutters that make the numbers blur and dance like digital ghosts. The time remains accurate, but something in the quality of the light feels different, hungrier, and my phone has been warm to the touch all day, even when I'm not using it, as if something inside is working overtime, preparing for transmission. I lie here now, watching those red numbers creep toward midnight, wondering what new horror they might reveal, wondering if I'm losing my mind or saving lives, and whether there's really any difference between the two. The clock reads 11:58 p.m. Soon I'll know if tonight brings another call to action, another chance to prove that I'm listening, that I understand my role in this strange partnership between man and machine, or perhaps tonight will bring something else entirely. Something that will force me to confront the possibility that I haven't been chosen as a guardian, but as something far less pleasant. The numbers flip. 11:59. My phone begins to grow warm against the nightstand. In the distance, I can hear sirens that might be coming closer. And somewhere in the building, a smoke detector begins to chirp its low battery warning, adding its voice to the electronic chorus that seems to follow me wherever I go. The clock shows midnight now, and I wait for instructions from devices that shouldn't be able to think, shouldn't be able to care, shouldn't be able to reach across the void between silicon and flesh to whisper warnings in the digital dark, but they do, and I listen, because in a world where meaning is scarce and purpose even scarcer, sometimes being chosen, even by forces you can't understand or control, is better than being ignored, even if you're never entirely sure whether you're the hero of the story or just another component in a machine too complex for human comprehension. The red numbers pulse like a digital heartbeat, counting down to something I can feel approaching but cannot name. And I wait, watching, ready to answer when the call comes. Because somewhere in this city of millions, someone needs saving. And apparently, the job is mine. Story 10. The first thing you need to understand about insomnia is that it changes the texture of reality. Colors become more saturated, shadows gain weight, and the familiar architecture of your home transforms into something foreign and watchful. I've been dancing with sleeplessness for 3 weeks now, ever since the promotion at the firm started demanding 16-hour days, and my mind forgot how to shut down. That night, the night everything shifted, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting the subtle imperfections in the paint while my partner slept beside me. His breathing was deep and rhythmic, the kind of peaceful sleep I envied with every fiber of my exhausted being. The digital clock on the nightstand pulsed 3:17 a.m. in accusatory red numerals. The bedroom door stood ajar, creating a vertical slice of hallway darkness that seemed to breathe with the house's settling. I'd grown accustomed to these late-night vigils, to the way familiar objects became sentinels in the dark, but something felt different. The air carried a weight I couldn't name, thick and expectant, like the moment before thunder breaks. That's when I saw him. A silhouette filled the doorway, leaning casually against the frame with an unmistakable tilt to the head. Even in the darkness, I could make out the curve of his shoulders, the familiar slope of his stance, but what made my blood crystallize in my veins was the smile. I couldn't see it clearly, but I felt it, a wide, knowing grin that spoke of secrets and amusement at my expense. My throat constricted as I tried to speak. "Stop it, you're scaring me." The words came out as barely more than a whisper, swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the house. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my plea. It simply stood there, radiating that terrible amusement, that sense of being observed and found wanting. Then, cutting through the silence like a blade, came the sound of the toilet flushing from the bathroom down the hall. The silhouette vanished. Water rushed through the pipes within the walls, a familiar domestic sound that should have been comforting, but instead felt like mockery. Footsteps padded across the bathroom tiles, and moments later, my partner emerged from the hallway, drying his hands on a towel. He moved with the casual ease of someone half asleep, completely unaware of my rigid posture in the bed. "You okay?" he mumbled, tossing the towel toward the hamper and missing. I couldn't form words. My eyes darted between his face and the doorway where the figure had stood. The space between the bed and the door had become arctic, as if someone had opened an invisible freezer and let the cold spill across the hardwood floors. My breath came in visible puffs, though the thermostat hadn't changed. Just couldn't sleep, I managed. He slipped back under the covers, his warmth a stark contrast to the inexplicable chill that seemed to emanate from the doorway. Within minutes, his breathing deepened again, leaving me alone with the pounding of my heart and the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted in the fabric of our home. I lay awake until dawn, watching that doorway with the vigilance of a sentry, but nothing else materialized. The cold gradually receded as morning light began to filter through the curtains, and with it came the rationalization that exhaustion brings. Sleep deprivation causes hallucinations. Everyone knows that. The mind, desperate for rest, begins to manufacture experiences from the shadows and silence. But logic is a poor fortress against the kind of fear that burrows into your bones. The next morning brought the discovery that would shatter my carefully constructed explanations. I was getting dressed in the walk-in closet, reaching for a shirt from the upper rack, when my reflection in the full-length mirror stopped me cold. There, at exactly my eye level, were two handprints pressed against the glass from the inside. The marks were foggy and indistinct, as if someone had breathed on the mirror and then placed their palms against it. But they were unmistakably there. The positioning was what made my skin crawl. They were placed precisely where someone standing behind the mirror would rest their hands while leaning forward, as if to get a better look at something, or someone, in the room. The angle suggested whoever made them had been watching the bed, studying the space where I slept. I called out to my partner, but he was already in the shower. The sound of running water echoed through the house like white noise, drowning out my thoughts. I approached the mirror slowly, my reflection fragmenting around those ghostly prints. When I reached out to touch them, my fingers came away damp and cold. The logical explanations crumbled one by one. The mirror hadn't been cleaned in weeks. Where had the moisture come from? The prints were too high to be mine, and my partner was shorter than I was. The positioning was all wrong for someone standing in the closet. They could only have been made by someone behind the glass, someone looking out from within the mirror itself. I spent the day at the office trying to focus on contracts and depositions, but my mind kept drifting back to those prints. Every reflective surface, computer screens, windows, the bathroom mirror, seemed to hold the potential for surveillance. I caught myself checking over my shoulder, searching for figures that shouldn't be there, for smiles that didn't belong. When I returned home that evening, the first thing I did was check the closet mirror. The prints were gone, leaving nothing but pristine glass that reflected my own haggard face. My partner was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly to himself, completely oblivious to my growing paranoia. "Did you clean the mirror in the closet today?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He paused in his chopping. "What mirror? Why would I clean the mirror?" His confusion seemed genuine, but doubt had already taken root. I found myself studying his face for signs of deception, for that knowing smile I'd seen in the doorway, but there was nothing there except concern for my obvious distress. The next few days passed in a haze of hyper-awareness, every creak of the house settling, every shadow that moved wrong, every reflection that seemed slightly off became a potential threat. I installed motion sensor lights in the hallway, checked the locks multiple times each night, and found excuses to avoid the walk-in closet. Sleep became even more elusive. When I did manage to doze, I'd jolt awake with the certainty that someone was watching me, only to find the room empty and my partner sleeping peacefully beside me. The space near the doorway remained consistently cold, as if the house itself had developed a fever that localized in that one spot. I began to notice other things, small displacements of objects. A book moved from one side of the nightstand to the other. A picture frame shifted slightly askew. my coffee mug appearing in rooms I hadn't visited. Each incident could be explained away by forgetfulness or my partner's movements, but the accumulation created a sense of being slowly, methodically invaded. The breaking point came a week later. I was lying in bed, fighting another bout of insomnia, when I heard the soft whisper of footsteps in the hallway. They were careful, deliberate, the sound of someone trying not to be heard. My partner was beside me, his breathing deep and undisturbed, but the footsteps continued, a slow patrol back and forth past our bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to hear every nuance of sound. The footsteps stopped directly outside our room, and I could sense a presence there, waiting and watching. The temperature plummeted again, and frost began to form on the windows despite the mild autumn weather outside. Then came the sound that nearly stopped my heart. The soft scrape of fingernails against wood, as if someone was gently tapping against the doorframe in a rhythm I couldn't quite decipher. It was patient and methodical, like a secret code being transmitted through the darkness. I wanted to wake my partner, to have someone else witness what was happening, but a deeper instinct held me paralyzed. Some primitive part of my brain understood that acknowledging the presence might invite it closer, might cross a threshold I wasn't prepared to traverse. The tapping continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The cold retreated, the footsteps faded, and I was left alone with my racing heart and the growing certainty that I was losing my grip on reality. In the morning, I found scratches in the doorframe at exactly the height where the tapping had occurred. They were fresh, cutting through layers of paint to expose the raw wood beneath. When I showed them to my partner, he examined them with genuine puzzlement. Maybe the cat, he suggested. Though we both knew our cat had been declawed years ago, I began researching sleep deprivation and its effects on perception. The articles were full of cautionary tales about hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and the way chronic insomnia could warp reality beyond recognition. I read about people who became convinced their homes were haunted, only to discover their experiences were products of exhausted minds creating scenarios from shadow and suggestion. But research couldn't explain the physical evidence, the handprints, the scratches, the persistent cold that had taken up residence in our bedroom. It couldn't account for the way my partner sometimes paused mid-conversation, his head tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear, or the brief moments when his reflection seemed to smile while his actual face remained neutral. I started sleeping in the guest room, claiming it was to avoid disturbing him with my restlessness. The change of venue brought temporary relief, but it didn't last. Soon, the same phenomena began manifesting in the new space. Cold spots, shadows that moved independently of their sources, and the persistent sensation of being observed. The guest room mirror began showing its own anomalies. Condensation would appear in impossible patterns, and sometimes, when I looked at just the right angle, I could swear I saw movement behind the glass, a subtle shift in the reflected room that didn't match reality. I considered the possibility that I was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown. The stress of work, combined with chronic sleep deprivation, could certainly account for hallucinations and paranoid thinking. But the physical evidence persisted, accumulating like proof of something I didn't want to believe. 3 weeks into my exile in the guest room, I made a discovery that shattered what remained of my rational explanations. I was reviewing security footage from the motion cameras I'd installed throughout the house, looking for evidence of what was happening during my periods of disturbed sleep. Most of the footage showed exactly what you'd expect. Empty hallways, the occasional movement of our cat, the familiar rhythms of a house at rest. But there were anomalies. Sections where the timestamp would skip forward several minutes without explanation, or where the temperature readings would show dramatic drops in specific areas while the rest of the house remained normal. Most disturbing were the moments when the cameras captured my partner moving through the house during times when he should have been asleep. The footage showed him walking with purpose through the dark hallways, pausing outside doors, and standing motionless in front of mirrors for extended periods. His movements were fluid and silent, lacking the fumbling uncertainty of someone navigating in darkness. But what made my blood turn to ice was the expression on his face. Even in the grainy black and white footage, I could see that same knowing smile, that look of secret amusement that I'd glimpsed in the doorway that first night. It was an expression I'd never seen him wear in waking hours, a mask that transformed his familiar features into something alien and predatory. The footage raised questions I didn't want to ask. Was my partner somehow responsible for the strange occurrences? Was he sleepwalking and creating the disturbances I'd been attributing to supernatural forces? Or was something else wearing his face during those midnight wanderings? I confronted him about the footage, showing him the timestamps and the inexplicable gaps in recording. His confusion appeared genuine, his concern for my mental state seemingly authentic. He suggested I see a doctor, mentioned stress and exhaustion with the loving patience of someone watching a partner spiral into paranoia, but I noticed he avoided looking directly at the computer screen while the footage played. His eyes would dart away whenever his nighttime self appeared, as if he couldn't bear to witness his own somnambulistic activities. That night, I pretended to sleep in the guest room while actually maintaining vigilant watch through a crack in the door. Around 2 a.m., I heard the soft whisper of bare feet on hardwood. My partner emerged from our bedroom with that same fluid grace I'd seen in the security footage, moving through the house with purposeful silence. I followed at a distance, my heart hammering against my ribs as he led me through a tour of our own home that felt like trespassing. He paused at each mirror, standing motionless while something that wasn't quite reflection stared back from the glass. The temperature dropped wherever he lingered, and frost began forming on every reflective surface. He ended his circuit in the walk-in closet, positioning himself behind the full-length mirror, with his palms pressed against the glass. From my hidden vantage point, I could see both his physical form and his reflection, and they didn't quite match. His reflection smiled while his face remained neutral, and his reflected hands moved independently of his actual ones, tracing patterns on the glass that left no marks. I watched in horrified fascination as he leaned forward, his reflection pressing close to the glass, as if trying to break through from the other side. The smile widened, becoming something inhuman and hungry, while his physical form remained perfectly still and expressionless. The scene lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, he straightened and walked away, leaving me alone with the certain knowledge that whatever was happening in our house had nothing to do with stress or sleep deprivation. The next morning, I found new handprints on the mirror, positioned exactly where I'd seen him place his palms. But these prints were on the inside of the glass, pressed outward as if something within the reflection was trying to escape. I haven't slept since that night. I've been sitting in this chair, watching the mirrors, and waiting for something to make sense. My partner continues his daily routines with perfect normalcy, expressing concern for my obvious deterioration while seeming completely unaware of his nocturnal activities. But I've noticed his reflection has begun moving independently, even during daylight hours. Sometimes I catch it smiling when he's not, or gesturing when his hands are still. The cold spots have spread throughout the house, and every reflective surface has become a potential portal for whatever is pressing against the boundary between reflection and reality. I don't know if my partner is sleepwalking into something inhuman, or if something inhuman is wearing his sleeping form. I don't know if the mirrors are windows to another dimension, or if my exhausted mind has finally snapped completely. What I do know is that the handprints appear fresh every morning, and they're always positioned as if someone behind the glass is watching me sleep. What I know is that the scratches on the doorframe grow deeper each night, counting down to something I don't want to understand. And what I know, with the crystalline certainty that comes from weeks of sleepless observation, is that whatever is happening here isn't finished with me yet. The mirrors are waiting, the reflections are hungry, and my partner's smile has begun bleeding through into his waking hours. Story 11. The first time I saw them, I convinced myself it was sleep deprivation playing tricks on my eyes. I'd been watching over old Theodore for 3 weeks by then, spending Tuesday and Thursday nights on his couch while his daughter flew back and forth from Seattle, trying to arrange his care. The man was 87, sharp as a tack during the day, but something about the darkness seemed to unsettle him. He'd requested someone stay over, and the daughter had found me through a caregiving service downtown. Theodore's house felt older than it probably was. Built in the 40s, she'd told me, but the walls seemed to hold decades of whispered conversations and the particular mustiness that clings to places where time moves differently. The hardwood floors creaked in a rhythm I'd grown accustomed to, and the radiator in the corner hissed like something alive, breathing in the shadows. It was nearly 3 in the morning when I heard the sound. A sharp crack, like wood splitting, came from somewhere above my head. I'd been dozing in the armchair beside his bed, a paperback novel splayed across my chest, when the noise jolted me awake. My first thought was settling beams. Old houses did that, especially during temperature changes. But the sound came again, more deliberate this time, followed by what I can only describe as a gentle tapping. That's when I saw the light. At first, it was just a flicker in my peripheral vision, a golden gleam near the corner where the ceiling met the wall. I turned my head slowly, afraid that sudden movement might make it disappear, and watched as tiny points of light began seeping through the plaster like liquid gold finding cracks in a dam. They moved with purpose, these sparks, swirling in slow spirals about 6 inches from the ceiling. Not random, not chaotic, but with the deliberate grace of fish swimming in an aquarium. The light they cast was warm, almost honeyed. Nothing like the harsh fluorescence in the hallway or the cold blue glow of the street lamp outside. I sat transfixed, my book sliding off my lap and hitting the floor with a soft thud. The sparks seemed to pulse gently, growing brighter and dimmer in unison, as if breathing. There were perhaps a dozen of them, each no larger than a firefly, but infinitely more controlled in their movements. Theodore stirred in his bed. I glanced over, expecting to find him still asleep, but his eyes were open, staring directly at the corner where the lights danced. His expression wasn't one of surprise or fear, but rather the weary recognition of someone greeting an old acquaintance. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right arm from beneath the covers and extended it toward the lights, palm outward, in a gesture that seemed both protective and dismissive. His lips barely moved as he whispered something I couldn't quite catch. The sound was soft, almost tender, like someone shooing away a beloved pet that had wandered into the wrong room at the wrong time. The lights responded immediately. Their dancing slowed, became more subdued, and one by one, they began to fade, seeping back into the wall as gradually as they had emerged. Within moments, the corner was dark again, ordinary plaster meeting ordinary paint, and I was left wondering if I'd dreamed the entire encounter. Theodore's arm lowered back to his side, and his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. I didn't move for the next hour, afraid that shifting position might somehow trigger their return. My neck grew stiff from craning toward the corner, and my eyes burned from staring at the spot where they'd appeared, searching for any hint of their presence. But the wall remained stubbornly normal, betraying nothing. When morning came, flooding the room with ordinary sunlight and the distant sounds of traffic, I felt foolish for having been so transfixed. Theodore woke at his usual time, stretching and yawning like any other elderly man greeting another day. He shuffled to the bathroom, then to the kitchen, where he began his morning routine of coffee and toast, with the same methodical precision he'd shown every day since I'd started staying with him. I waited until he was seated at the small breakfast table, his coffee steaming in the morning light streaming through the window, before I worked up the courage to mention what I'd seen. He listened without interruption as I described the lights, the sounds, his own response to them. His weathered hands remained steady around his coffee cup, and his pale blue eyes never left my face. When I finished, he took a slow sip of his coffee and set the cup down with deliberate care. They'd come to check if everything was in order, he said simply, as if this explained everything. His tone carried the matter-of-fact quality of someone discussing the weather or the mail delivery. He'd been expecting them, he added, though perhaps not quite so soon. I pressed him for more details, but he'd already moved on, asking about my plans for the day and whether I thought the newspaper might be late again. The conversation felt like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Every question I asked seemed to slip away before I could grasp a solid answer. The following Tuesday night, I arrived at Theodore's house with a heightened awareness that felt almost electric. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every ordinary house sound carried additional weight. I'd spent the intervening days researching everything I could about hallucinations, sleep deprivation, and the effects of prolonged stress on perception. The explanations I found were logical, scientific, and utterly failing to diminish the memory of those golden sparks moving with such deliberate intention. Theodore seemed unusually alert that evening, more talkative than usual as we sat in his living room watching the news. He told me stories about the neighborhood, about the families who'd lived in the surrounding houses over the decades, about the subtle changes he'd witnessed from his front porch. But there was something underneath his casual conversation, a current of anticipation that I couldn't quite identify. The sparks didn't appear that night, or the next Thursday, or the Tuesday after that. I began to relax, to convince myself that whatever I'd seen had been an anomaly, a one-time event triggered by exhaustion or stress, or the particular combination of shadows and streetlight that had somehow created an optical illusion. But they were waiting for me at home. I first noticed them on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after that initial encounter at Theodore's house. I'd been reading in my apartment, a small one-bedroom place on the second floor of a converted Victorian about 10 minutes from Theodore's neighborhood. The walls were thin, and I'd grown accustomed to the sounds of my neighbors, footsteps overhead, muffled television dialogue, the occasional burst of laughter or conversation. The sparks appeared near my bookshelf, close to where I kept a collection of framed photographs inherited from my grandmother. Family pictures spanning decades, faces of relatives I'd known, and others I'd only heard about in stories. The shelf sat against the wall that separated my apartment from the unit next door, and I'd sometimes hear my neighbor moving around, the sound of furniture being shifted or drawers being opened and closed. But this was different. The lights emerged gradually, seeping through the wall near the bottom shelf where my grandmother's wedding photo sat beside a picture of my parents from their college graduation. The same warm golden glow, the same deliberate movements, but somehow more insistent than they'd been at Theodore's house. These sparks seemed to pulse with greater urgency, their dance more rapid, more demanding. I stood from my reading chair, my heart hammering against my ribs, and watched as they swirled in increasingly complex patterns. They seemed to be examining the photographs, hovering near each frame for several seconds, before moving on to the next. When they reached the picture of my grandmother, they paused for a long moment, their light growing noticeably brighter. The rational part of my mind cycled through explanations, reflections from passing cars, some trick of light from the street lamp outside, electrical issues causing brief illumination from a neighbor's apartment. But none of these explanations could account for the purposeful quality of their movement, the sense that they were searching for something specific. Without quite realizing I was going to speak, I whispered the word that came to me. Okay. The effect was immediate. The sparks slowed their movement, their light softening to a gentler glow, and one by one they began to recede into the wall. But unlike at Theodore's house, they didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they seemed to settle just beneath the surface, visible as faint glimmers if I looked at the wall from the right angle. I spent the rest of the evening moving around my apartment, checking each room, examining every wall and corner for signs of their presence. They remained near the bookshelf, barely perceptible unless I focused directly on the spot, like stars that become visible only when you're not looking straight at them. Sleep came eventually, but it was restless, filled with dreams of golden lights flowing through walls like luminous blood through cosmic veins. I woke several times, checking the bookshelf, finding the sparks still there, still waiting. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Every few nights, they would emerge more fully, dancing their careful exploration of my photographs before settling back into their dormant state. I began to anticipate their appearances, to prepare for them. I moved my reading chair closer to the bookshelf, positioned a small lamp to provide better illumination, and started keeping a notebook where I recorded the timing and duration of each encounter. The notes revealed a disturbing consistency. The sparks appeared most frequently on Tuesday and Thursday nights, the same schedule I maintained at Theodore's house. They seemed drawn particularly to the older photographs, spending more time near images of people who had died, less time near recent pictures of living relatives. I mentioned none of this to Theodore during my regular visits. Our conversations had grown more guarded since that first morning, when he'd explained their presence so matter-of-factly. I found myself watching him carefully, looking for signs that he might be experiencing similar visits at times when I wasn't there. But he revealed nothing, maintaining his routine with the same quiet dignity he'd always shown. It was during my Thursday night stay in late November that I realized the sparks at Theodore's house had evolved as well. I'd grown comfortable with their absence there, assuming that whatever phenomenon I was experiencing had relocated entirely to my own apartment. But that night, as I dozed in my usual chair beside his bed, I heard the familiar cracking sound from the ceiling corner. When I looked up, expecting to see the gentle dance I remembered from that first encounter, I found something altogether more complex. The sparks were organized now, arranged in formations that suggested meaning beyond my comprehension. They moved in synchronized groups, creating patterns that reminded me of constellations or electrical diagrams or the flowing script of a language written in light. Their color had deepened too, shifting from the warm gold I remembered to something richer, more amber, more substantial. Theodore was awake, watching them with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the weary tolerance of that first night, but something approaching reverence. His lips moved constantly now, not in the single whispered dismissal I'd heard before, but in what appeared to be an ongoing conversation conducted in sounds too soft for me to distinguish. The lights responded to his whispers, their formations shifting and reorganizing in ways that suggested they were not merely dancing, but communicating. They would cluster near the ceiling, spread into complex geometric patterns, then contract into tight spirals before beginning the cycle again. Each transformation seemed to correspond to something Theodore was saying, as if they were engaged in a dialogue of light and whisper. I remained motionless in my chair, afraid that any movement might interrupt whatever was happening between them. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, the sparks growing gradually brighter and more active, Theodore's whispers becoming slightly more audible, though still incomprehensible. Finally, the lights began to fade, not abruptly as they had that first night, but slowly, reluctantly, like visitors departing after a long and important discussion. Theodore's whispers trailed off as well, and soon the room was dark and quiet, filled only with the familiar sounds of his sleeping breath and the radiator's gentle hiss. But I knew something fundamental had changed. Over the next several visits, the pattern repeated with variations. The sparks appeared more frequently, stayed longer, engaged in increasingly elaborate displays. Theodore's responses grew more animated, his whispered conversations extending deep into the night. Sometimes I caught fragments of actual words, references to time, to waiting, to preparations that needed to be made, and my own apartment experiences intensified correspondingly. The sparks there had begun appearing nightly, no longer content to remain dormant near the bookshelf. They explored my entire living space now, flowing from room to room like curious scouts mapping unfamiliar territory. They seemed particularly interested in anything connected to my work with Theodore, the bag I carried to his house, the clothes I wore during my visits, the notebook where I'd been recording their appearances. I found myself talking to them more frequently, offering the same okay that had seemed to satisfy them that first night. But the word felt increasingly inadequate, like trying to hold a complex conversation with a vocabulary of one. They would pause when I spoke, their light dimming slightly as if in acknowledgement, but I sensed they were waiting for something more substantial from me. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in early December. I'd arrived at Theodore's house to find him unusually agitated, pacing between the kitchen and living room with nervous energy I'd never seen before. He kept glancing at the ceiling corners, checking his watch, adjusting and readjusting the position of items on his nightstand. When I asked if everything was all right, he told me they'd been early the night before, earlier than they'd ever been, and that this meant adjustments would need to be made. I pressed him for details about these adjustments, but he waved away my questions with the same evasive gestures he'd used since that first morning. Instead, he asked me whether I'd been sleeping well lately, whether I'd noticed anything unusual in my own living space, whether I understood that some responsibilities couldn't be avoided indefinitely. The question chilled me more than the sparks themselves ever had. The implication that Theodore knew about my experiences, that whatever was happening extended beyond the boundaries of his house, suggested a scope and intentionality that made my careful, rational explanations crumble completely. That night, the sparks appeared earlier than ever before, emerging from the ceiling corner before midnight while Theodore was still technically awake, though lying quietly in his bed. But instead of their usual organized formations, they seemed chaotic, urgent, moving in rapid, erratic patterns that made them difficult to follow. Theodore's response was equally agitated. His whispers came faster, more insistent, and for the first time I caught clear words. Preparations, transitions, readiness, acceptance. The sparks responded by clustering directly above his bed, their light growing so bright it cast actual shadows in the room. The conversation, for that's clearly what it was, continued for several minutes before reaching what seemed to be a resolution. The sparks arranged themselves in a perfect circle above Theodore's head, pulsed 3 times in unison, then dispersed to form a pattern I'd never seen before. A series of interconnected spirals that reminded me of a map or diagram, as if they were showing him something specific. Theodore nodded once, whispered what sounded like agreement, and the lights began their familiar retreat into the wall. But as they faded, I noticed something that made my blood turn cold. A few of the sparks didn't disappear with the others. Instead, they drifted slowly across the room, moving deliberately in my direction. I remained perfectly still as they approached, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. The sparks circled my chair 3 times, their warm light playing across my face and hands, before settling into a loose formation directly in front of me. They hung there for several seconds, pulsing gently, and I had the unmistakable impression that they were studying me, evaluating me, reaching some kind of decision about my suitability for something I couldn't comprehend. Then they spoke. Not in words, not in any language I could recognize, but directly into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. The communication came as a flood of images and sensations, corridors of light stretching through impossible distances, networks of connection linking countless points across space and time, and the overwhelming understanding that watching was not just an activity, but a fundamental responsibility that maintained the structure of something vast and essential. The message was clear. Theodore's time as a watcher was ending, and I was being offered his position. The sparks faded completely, leaving me alone with Theodore's sleeping form and the weight of an impossible choice. I understood now why he'd seemed so matter-of-fact about their presence, why he'd accepted their visits with such resigned dignity. He'd been chosen, as I was now being chosen, to serve as a guardian of something that existed beyond ordinary comprehension. I sat in that chair until dawn, staring at the corner where they'd appeared, trying to process what had happened. When Theodore woke, he looked at me with eyes that held complete understanding of what I'd experienced. He asked no questions, offered no explanations, but simply nodded and began his morning routine with the air of someone who had passed a burden to capable hands. The sparks haven't appeared at his house since that night, but in my apartment, they've become constant companions, flowing through my walls at all hours, teaching me the subtle art of observation, showing me the networks of connection that link every living thing to patterns of existence too complex for ordinary perception. I've learned that watching isn't passive but participatory, that consciousness itself is a form of maintenance work, performed on the infrastructure of reality. I still go to Theodore's house on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but our roles have shifted. He sleeps peacefully now, the deep sleep of someone whose watch has ended, while I sit alert in the darkness, my attention focused on dimensions of existence I'm only beginning to understand. Sometimes I catch myself wondering whether any of this is real, whether the sparks are genuine phenomena or elaborate hallucinations born from stress and sleep deprivation, and the particular isolation that comes from spending too many nights in other people's houses. But the question feels less important now than it once did. What matters is the watching itself, the act of remaining alert to currents of meaning that flow just beneath the surface of ordinary experience. Whether the sparks exist as objective reality or subjective perception seems irrelevant compared to the responsibility I've accepted to serve as a guardian of something essential and vast. The lights are with me now as I write this, flowing around my apartment in their endless patterns of exploration and connection. They've grown brighter over the weeks, more substantial, as if my acceptance has strengthened their ability to manifest in this reality. Sometimes I think I can see them during daylight hours, threading through the walls of buildings throughout the city, connecting every structure in a web of golden light that pulses with the rhythm of collective awareness. I know there are others like me, other watchers maintaining their vigil in apartments and houses throughout the world, each serving as a node in a network that spans dimensions I can barely conceptualize. We're all connected by these flowing streams of light, all participating in a form of consciousness that exists on scales both infinitely small and unimaginably vast. And I know that someday, when my own watch reaches its end, the sparks will choose someone else to carry on this responsibility. Someone who will sit in the darkness, alert and waiting, maintaining the delicate balance that keeps reality flowing smoothly through its appointed channels. Until then, I watch, and the lights dance, and everything remains in order. Story 12. The back door handle moved with the deliberate slowness of someone testing their luck. I froze on the couch, remote control suspended halfway to the coffee table, my Friday night movie forgotten as the brass mechanism twisted left, then right, then left again. 3 precise movements, each separated by the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. My thumb found the smart home app before my brain caught up. Every light in the house blazed to life simultaneously. Living room, kitchen, hallway, even the basement fixtures I rarely used. The sudden illumination felt like a shield, and whatever had been manipulating my door handle apparently agreed. The rattling stopped. I waited, counted to 60, then to 100. The house hummed with electronic certainty, every corner banished of shadows, yet the silence felt heavier than before. When I finally worked up the courage to approach the back door, my bare feet whispered against the hardwood with embarrassing caution. The door was locked, deadbolt engaged, chain latch secure. Through the window, my back porch sat empty under the harsh glare of the motion sensor light. Nothing moved in the small yard beyond except the neighbor's cat picking its way across the fence. But there, on the welcome mat just outside the door, lay a business card. I stared at it through the glass for a long moment before unlocking the door. The card was old, the kind of cheap cardstock that yellows at the edges and develops that specific musty smell of forgotten desk drawers. Fletcher Security Solutions, it read in faded blue lettering. Professional lock installation and repair. A phone number, an address downtown that I vaguely remembered as a sandwich shop now. I flipped the card over. There, in ballpoint pen that had bled slightly into the porous paper, was my address. Not just the street and number, but apartment 2B specifically. The handwriting was unfamiliar, angular, and rushed. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone and dialed the number. 3 rings. Then a recording. The number you have dialed is not in service. Please check the number and dial again. I tried twice more with the same result. Back inside, I placed the card on my kitchen counter and stared at it under the bright overhead lights. The paper felt substantial between my fingers, not like something that had been sitting outside in the weather. The ink was old, but clear. Real. I'd lived in this apartment for 3 years, never had any lock work done, never called a locksmith. The previous tenant had been an elderly woman who'd lived here for decades before moving to assisted living. I'd met her briefly during the walkthrough. A sweet grandmother type who'd seemed incapable of mysterious nocturnal activities. The smart home app on my phone showed no alerts from the motion sensors. According to the log, the back porch light had activated once at 9:17 p.m., which was exactly when I'd turned on all the house lights. Before that, nothing since this morning when I'd taken out the trash. I poured myself a whiskey and tried to rationalize. Teenagers, maybe. Some elaborate prank. But what kind of prank involved vintage business cards with my address written on them? And why would they have stopped when the lights came on if they were just messing around? The alternative explanations felt less comfortable. A former employee of Fletcher Security, perhaps. Someone with old cards and a grudge against the building's management company. A confused elderly person, though that didn't explain the precise timing or the mysterious disappearance. I turned off most of the lights and tried to return to my movie, but concentration was impossible. Every small sound, the refrigerator cycling, the upstairs neighbor's footsteps, the building settling, sent my pulse racing. I found myself checking the smart home app obsessively, watching the real-time feed from the motion sensors like a security guard on high alert. Nothing happened for 2 hours. By midnight, I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing. Some weird coincidence. A prank. A mistake. Then I heard it again. This time, the sound was different. Not the testing rattle from before, but a slow, deliberate turn. The handle rotated a quarter of the way, paused, then returned to its original position. The movement was smooth, controlled, purposeful, and it came from inside. I stood in my living room, every nerve ending alive with electric fear, staring down the hallway toward the back door. The sound had definitely originated from this side. Someone inside my apartment had turned the handle, but I was alone. I'd been alone all evening. The front door was locked and chained. The windows were secure. There was no other way in. My mind raced through possibilities. A mechanical issue with the smart lock system, some kind of automated cycling. But the movement had been too organic, too deliberate. Machines don't pause mid-turn like they're listening for something. I grabbed a kitchen knife, not because I intended to use it, but because holding something solid made me feel slightly less helpless, and crept toward the back door. Each step felt like crossing into enemy territory. The hallway stretched impossibly long under the dim light I'd left on. The door was still locked, deadbolt engaged, chain latch secure, everything exactly as I'd left it hours earlier. I stood there for 10 minutes, knife in hand, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The house remained silent except for the whisper of the heating system and the distant hum of late-night traffic. When I finally returned to the living room, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The business card was no longer on the kitchen counter where I'd left it. I searched frantically. Counter, floor, nearby cabinets. I checked the trash, thinking maybe I'd thrown it away without remembering. I retraced my steps from the back door to the kitchen, scanning every surface. The card was gone, but I knew I hadn't moved it. I remembered the weight of it in my hands, the specific spot where I'd placed it next to the coffee maker. The image was crystal clear in my memory. Unless it wasn't. Unless my mind was playing tricks, rewriting recent history to fit some internal narrative I couldn't quite grasp. Stress could do that, couldn't it? Make you forget small actions, misplace things, imagine details that felt completely real. I'd been working 60-hour weeks lately. The promotion at the engineering firm had come with more responsibility and less sleep. I'd been drinking more coffee, sleeping less, relying on takeout and frozen meals. Classic recipe for psychological breakdown, if you believe the health articles that kept popping up in my news feed. Maybe there had never been a business card. Maybe the door handle had rattled because of wind or building settlement or some other perfectly rational explanation. Maybe I'd imagined the precise, deliberate turn because my subconscious was creating patterns where none existed. The relief of this possibility lasted exactly until I noticed the scratches. They were faint, barely visible under the hallway light, but definitely there. Small metal filings scattered on the floor beneath the back door handle. Fresh scratches on the brass mechanism itself, as if someone had been working at it with tools. I knelt and collected some of the filings on my fingertip. They were real. Solid. Definitely metal. The scratches on the handle were consistent with someone attempting to manipulate the locking mechanism from the inside. But that was impossible. I'd been in the apartment all evening. I would have heard someone working at the lock. The motion sensors would have detected movement. The smart home system would have logged any breach, unless the system had malfunctioned, unless someone had found a way to disable it, unless someone had been inside the apartment all along, waiting in some hidden space I'd never discovered. The building was old, converted from a larger single-family home decades ago. There could be crawl spaces, forgotten closets, areas behind the walls where someone could hide. The thought sent me rushing through every room, checking behind curtains, under the bed, inside the coat closet. Nothing. No evidence of intrusion. No signs of disturbance except for those metal filings that shouldn't exist. I called the police, then hung up before the call connected. What would I tell them? That someone had left me a business card that disappeared, rattled my door handle, and filed some scratches on my lock without triggering any of my security systems? They'd think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. I spent the rest of the night in the living room chair, knife within reach, watching the hallway and checking my phone obsessively. The smart home app showed normal readings, motion sensors quiet, all entry points secure. Everything perfectly normal except for the growing certainty that someone was watching me. The feeling was physical, like pressure between my shoulder blades, the specific awareness that comes from being observed without knowing from where. I found myself turning suddenly, expecting to catch someone in my peripheral vision, but finding only empty rooms and long shadows. By dawn, exhaustion had blended with paranoia into something resembling acceptance. Either I was losing my mind, or something impossible was happening in my apartment. Both options felt equally terrifying. I made coffee and tried to approach the situation logically. If someone was getting into my apartment, how were they doing it? The front door had a smart lock with activity logs. The windows were painted shut and faced busy streets. The back door was the only realistic entry point, but it was also the one I'd been watching, unless they weren't coming from outside. The thought hit me like cold water. What if someone was already inside? Not hiding in closets or crawl spaces, but actually living here, in some parallel version of my apartment that intersected with mine only occasionally? I knew how insane that sounded, but it felt true in a way that rational explanations didn't. The careful, deliberate movements, the vintage business card with my address, the feeling of being watched from impossible angles. All of it suggested someone who knew my space intimately, who had reasons to be there that I couldn't understand. I started leaving subtle markers, a hair across the bathroom door, a penny balanced on the kitchen cabinet handle, small things that would be disturbed if someone moved through my apartment while I was gone. When I returned from work Monday evening, every marker was exactly where I'd left it. But the back door handle had been turned again. I could tell because I'd photographed it from multiple angles that morning, and the position was definitely different. The scratches had multiplied too. More metal filings on the floor. The brass mechanism now showed clear evidence of repeated manipulation. And there was something else. A smell I hadn't noticed before, lingering in the hallway near the back door. Something old and metallic, like coins left too long in a damp place. That night, I heard footsteps, not from the apartment above. I knew those sounds well after 3 years. These came from within my own space, soft and careful, moving from the back door toward the kitchen sometime around 2 a.m. I lay in bed, afraid to breathe, listening to someone navigate my apartment with the confidence of familiarity. Cabinet doors opened and closed. Water ran briefly in the kitchen sink. Footsteps crossed from linoleum to hardwood and back again. I never heard them leave. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, everything was normal. Kitchen exactly as I'd left it. Back door still locked. But the smell was stronger now, and there were wet footprints on the kitchen floor that hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed. The footprints were my size, my exact size. I stepped into them, and they matched perfectly. The next morning, I called in sick and drove to the downtown address from the business card. Fletcher Security Solutions had indeed operated there, in a narrow storefront that was now a Vietnamese restaurant. The owner, a friendly woman who spoke limited English, told me the previous business had closed maybe 5 years ago, maybe 6. She didn't know what had happened to the owner. The city records office had more information. Fletcher Security Solutions, registered to one Edward Fletcher, had operated for 17 years before dissolving in 2018. No forwarding address. No outstanding liens or debts. The business had simply stopped. I found Edward Fletcher's obituary in the local newspaper's online archives. He'd died at home in his sleep, age 67, survived by no immediate family. The address listed was across town, nowhere near my building, but the photograph made me drop my phone. Edward Fletcher looked exactly like me. Not similar, not reminiscent. Exact. The same angular face, The same dark hair, the same narrow-set eyes. He could have been my twin, or my father, or myself in 30 years. I drove to his old address that afternoon, hands shaking on the steering wheel. The house was modest, well-maintained, with a small sign in the front yard. For rent, contact property management. I called the number and, without really planning to, arranged a viewing. The property manager was a tired-looking woman in her 50s, who seemed more interested in her phone than showing the house. She led me through rooms that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. The layout was similar to my apartment but reversed, as if I were seeing my home in a mirror. In the basement, she showed me Edward Fletcher's old workshop. Previous tenant was some kind of locksmith, she explained, gesturing at the workbench still mounted to the far wall. Left all his tools behind. Landlord says whoever rents can keep them or throw them out. The tools were old but well-maintained. Lockpicks, key blanks, filing equipment. Everything you'd need to manipulate door hardware. And there, in a coffee can full of miscellaneous hardware, I found them. Business cards. Dozens of them. Fletcher Security Solutions, in that familiar faded blue lettering. I took one without thinking, slipping it into my pocket while the property manager wandered upstairs. On the drive home, I kept touching it through my jeans, reassuring myself it was real. That evening, I sat in my kitchen comparing the two cards, the one from my doorstep and the one from Edward Fletcher's workshop. They were identical. Same cardstock, same printing, same aging. But the one from the workshop was blank on the back. I took out a pen and wrote my address in angular, rushed handwriting that looked exactly like the original. My hand moved without conscious direction, forming letters that matched the mysterious writing perfectly. When I finished, I stared at the two cards side by side. They were indistinguishable. The realization hit me slowly, like waking from a dream. I'd been leaving the cards for myself. Somehow, impossibly, I'd been the one rattling my own door handle, manipulating my own locks, walking through my own apartment in the middle of the night. But I had no memory of any of it. That night, I stayed awake until 3 a.m., watching myself in the bathroom mirror, looking for signs of, what? Possession? Dissociation? Some kind of psychological break that would explain how I could be in two places at once? At 3:17 a.m., I watched my reflection turn and walk toward the back door. I followed myself down the hallway, helpless to stop what was happening. My body moved with purpose, hands working at the door lock with practiced efficiency. I used tools I didn't remember owning, manipulated mechanisms I didn't remember learning about. When the lock clicked open, I turned the handle exactly 1/4 turn, paused as if listening for something, then returned it to its original position. Then I walked back to the bathroom, looked at myself in the mirror, and forgot everything that had just happened. Until now. The business card is back on my kitchen counter, my address written in my own handwriting on the back. The back door handle shows fresh scratches from tools I apparently know how to use. And somewhere in my mind, Edward Fletcher is still working, still trying to solve whatever problem brought him to my address in the first place, still testing locks and leaving cards and walking through apartments in the middle of the night. I don't know if he's a ghost or a memory or some fragment of consciousness that survived in the tools I should never have touched. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something impossible is actually happening. What I know is this. Tomorrow night, I'll probably do it again. I'll walk to the back door, work at the lock, turn the handle a 1/4 turn, and forget by morning. Unless I remember. Unless writing this down breaks whatever cycle has been running in my head since I found that first card. The handle is turning now as I write this. Slow and deliberate, exactly 1/4 turn. I'm not touching it. I'm sitting here in my kitchen, typing, watching my back door handle move by itself while the rest of the apartment remains perfectly still, but I can feel myself getting up, walking toward the door, taking out tools I don't remember owning. I don't know if I'll remember this tomorrow. I don't know if it matters. The lock clicks open, and I understand everything and nothing at all. Story 13. The apartment felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. Not wrong in any way I could articulate. The furniture sat exactly where my friend had left it. The plants drooped with the same theatrical desperation they'd displayed for weeks, and the cat watched me with his usual mixture of disdain and hunger. But something in the air itself seemed to vibrate at a frequency just below perception, like standing too close to a massive speaker before the music begins. I'd been house-sitting for 3 days, a simple arrangement born of friendship and proximity. Water the plants twice weekly, feed the cat morning and evening, collect the mail. The kind of favor that requires no discussion, only a spare key and a promise to keep things intact. The 14th floor offered a view of the city that stretched to the harbor, all glass and steel catching the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. During the day, it felt like living inside a postcard. The nights were different. I'd noticed it the first evening, how the sounds changed after sunset. The traffic below seemed to fade not gradually but suddenly, as if someone had adjusted a volume dial. The neighbor's television, clearly audible through the thin walls during daylight hours, would cut to silence at precisely 10:30. Even the cat, normally vocal about his evening meal, had begun eating in complete quiet, ears constantly swiveling toward sounds I couldn't identify. By the third night, I'd begun to anticipate the wrongness, the way the air would thicken after 11, dense with the kind of humidity that belonged to summer nights by the ocean, not a high-rise apartment miles inland. The way shadows would stretch longer than the available light sources could account for, pooling in corners that should have remained illuminated by the street lamps below. I was reading when the knocking began. 3 sharp raps against the living room window, followed by silence so complete it felt aggressive. I looked up from my book, waiting for the sound to repeat, to reveal itself as settling building materials or wind against the glass. Instead, the quiet stretched and expanded until it became its own presence in the room. Then came the second sequence. 3 deliberate strikes, each one carrying enough force to rattle the frame slightly. The rhythm was too measured to be random, too purposeful to be natural. Someone was on the balcony. The thought carried an immediate impossibility that made my skin crawl. 14 floors up, with no fire escape, no maintenance platform, no conceivable way for anyone to reach the narrow strip of concrete outside the window. Yet the sound continued with mechanical precision. 3 knocks, 30 seconds of silence, 3 knocks again. I moved to the window with the careful movements of someone trying not to wake a sleeping predator. The blinds hung closed, slicing the view into horizontal strips of darkness and amber streetlight. I pressed my eye to the gap between slats and peered onto the balcony. Empty. Nothing but the small table and 2 chairs my friend had optimistically arranged for morning coffee. Though the space was barely large enough for a single person to stand comfortably, the railing stood intact, offering its meager protection against the long drop to the street below. No ladder, no rope, no explanation for the sound that continued with unwavering consistency. I pulled back from the window and noticed the cat had appeared at my feet, his usual indifference replaced by something approaching alarm. His ears lay flat against his skull, tail twitching in sharp, agitated movements. When the next sequence of knocks came, he bolted for the space beneath the sofa with a speed that spoke of genuine terror. The knocking continued for another 10 minutes, each cycle identical to the last. 3 deliberate strikes, pause, repeat. I found myself counting the intervals, timing them with the second hand of my watch. 28 seconds of silence, sometimes 30, never varying by more than 2 seconds in either direction. The precision felt more unsettling than randomness would have been. Then it stopped. Not gradually, not with a final sequence that might suggest someone walking away or giving up. Simply stopped, mid-cycle, after the second knock of what should have been another trio. The silence that followed felt different from the pauses between sequences, final rather than anticipatory. I remained at the window for several minutes, waiting for the sound to resume, but heard only the returning ambient noise of a city at night. The traffic below seemed to swell back to normal volume, as if someone had restored the audio to its proper level. From the apartment next door came the sudden blast of a late-night talk show, startling in its normalcy. I was turning away from the window when the shadow passed across the hallway. The movement was visible through the gap beneath the front door, a black shape sliding from left to right with the fluid motion of something untethered by normal physics. Not the broken stride of footsteps, or the irregular movement of someone walking past, but a smooth glide that seemed to continue far longer than the hallway could accommodate. The shape appeared perfectly flat, like a paper cutout held against a light source, but it moved with purpose, following the line of the hallway with deliberate intent. I found myself holding my breath, listening for accompanying sounds, footsteps, clothing rustling, breathing, but heard nothing except the renewed hammering of my own pulse. When the shadow finished its passage, I stood frozen for several seconds before approaching the door. The peephole offered a fisheye view of the hallway, distorting the familiar space into something that looked simultaneously too wide and too narrow. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual tune overhead, casting their reliable, harsh glow across beige carpet and cream walls, empty in both directions. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway, immediately struck by the smell of salt air so strong it made my eyes water. The scent carried the complexity of ocean water, not just salt, but seaweed, wet sand, the mineral smell of shells and driftwood. It filled the enclosed space with impossible intensity, as if I'd stepped onto a beach at low tide rather than into an interior hallway 14 floors above the city. The neighbors' doors remained closed, no light showing beneath any of them. The emergency exit sign at the far end glowed its reassuring red, pointing toward the stairwell that would lead me back to ground level and sanity. But I found myself paralyzed by the wrongness of the smell, the way it seemed to pulse with the fluorescent lights overhead, growing stronger and weaker in rhythm with their electrical hum. I walked the length of the hallway, checking each door for signs of forced entry or unusual activity. All appeared normal, the same scuff marks on the frames, the same welcome mats placed at identical angles, the same silence pressing against the doors from within. Yet the smell of ocean grew stronger as I moved, until it became almost overwhelming, bringing with it a sensation of vast open spaces that contradicted the enclosed hallway around me. At the end of the corridor, I pressed my ear to the emergency exit door and listened for sounds from the stairwell beyond. Nothing but the usual mechanical humming of a building at rest, the distant whisper of air moving through ventilation systems. When I pushed the door open and peered down the concrete steps, the ocean smell vanished immediately, replaced by the expected mustiness of rarely used emergency stairs. I returned to the apartment with questions multiplying in my mind like bacteria in a petri dish. The cat emerged from beneath the sofa as I locked the door behind me, approaching with cautious steps and eyes that seemed to hold more intelligence than I remembered. He sat at my feet and stared toward the window where the knocking had originated, tail still twitching with nervous energy. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I found sleep elusive. Every normal sound, the building settling, air moving through vents, the occasional car passing below, seemed amplified and potentially threatening. I dozed fitfully until dawn, when natural light began filtering through the blinds, and the apartment returned to its daytime personality of urban sophistication and comfortable familiarity. The next evening brought a repetition of the previous night's events, but with variations that suggested intelligence rather than mere repetition. The knocking began earlier, at 10:45, and followed a different pattern, 2 knocks instead of 3, with longer intervals between sequences. The cat reacted before the first sound, disappearing beneath the sofa while I was still reading, and unaware that anything unusual was about to occur. When I checked the balcony, I again found it empty, but this time noticed that the chairs had been rearranged, not dramatically, simply turned to face inward toward the window, rather than outward toward the view. Such a small change that I might have attributed it to wind, except that the evening was perfectly still, without even enough breeze to disturb the dust that had settled on the table's surface. The shadow in the hallway came earlier as well, passing while the knocking was still in progress. This time I was watching for it. My eye pressed to the gap beneath the door, and I saw it move in both directions, left to right, then back again, 5 minutes later. The second passage moved more slowly, with what appeared to be deliberate examination of each door it passed. The ocean smell was stronger on the second night, persisting even after I returned to the apartment. It seemed to cling to my clothes and skin, following me into the bedroom where it mixed with the familiar scents of laundry detergent and carpet cleaner. I found myself checking the windows repeatedly, looking for some source of the impossible aroma, but found only the sealed glass and the city view beyond. By the fifth night, I had begun to anticipate the events with a mixture of dread and scientific curiosity. The knocking now began at 10:30 exactly, always with a new pattern that seemed to follow rules I couldn't decipher. Sometimes a single knock repeated every few seconds, other times complex sequences that reminded me of Morse code or musical rhythms. The cat had taken to hiding hours before the sounds began, emerging only when dawn broke and normal reality reasserted itself. I started keeping a notebook, documenting the patterns and timing with the methodical attention of someone conducting an experiment. The sequences showed increasing complexity, but also increasing familiarity, as if whatever was creating them was learning my responses, adapting to my presence. When I moved closer to the window, the knocking would pause. When I stepped away, it would resume with renewed intensity. The shadows in the hallway had become multiple, sometimes 3 or 4 shapes moving in different directions simultaneously. They maintained their two-dimensional appearance, but seemed to interact with each other, pausing when they met, occasionally reversing direction as if engaged in some form of silent communication. The ocean smell now filled the entire building, detectable in the elevator and lobby, though other residents seemed unaware of it. I began to notice changes in my own behavior that I documented with growing unease. Sleep came only in fragments, interrupted by dreams of vast underwater spaces and the pressure of deep water against my lungs. My appetite disappeared, replaced by a constant thirst that no amount of water could satisfy. Most disturbing, I found myself drawn to the window during the knocking episodes, not to investigate, but to respond, my hand rising unbidden to rap against the glass in patterns that seemed to emerge from knowledge I didn't possess. The realization that I was participating rather than merely observing came on the 7th night, when I found myself standing at the window before the knocking began, my fist already raised to strike the glass. The awareness shocked me back to full consciousness, but left me with the unsettling knowledge that I had been moving without conscious intention, guided by impulses that felt foreign, yet familiar. I called my friend that night, reaching him at his hotel in another time zone. His voice sounded distant and slightly confused when I attempted to describe the events, and I found myself editing the details even as I spoke, reducing the supernatural elements to mundane concerns about building security and strange noises. He assured me that such sounds were common in high-rise buildings, that the cat often behaved strangely when his routine was disrupted, that my imagination was likely enhanced by the unfamiliar environment. His explanations felt reasonable in the bright safety of his voice, but dissolved the moment I ended the call. The notebook full of documented patterns, the rearranged furniture on the balcony, the impossible smell of ocean air, these remained as physical evidence that contradicted his rational dismissals. Either something extraordinary was occurring in the apartment, or my mind was constructing an elaborate delusion with remarkable consistency and detail. On the final night of my stay, the knocking began at 9 o'clock and continued without pause until dawn. The pattern was constant now, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat, occasionally doubling its tempo before returning to the original pace. I no longer attempted to look outside or investigate the hallway. Instead, I sat in the center of the living room and listened, the notebook open on my lap, documenting what might be my final observations. The cat joined me sometime after midnight, sitting close enough that I could feel his warmth against my leg. His fear seemed to have transformed into something approaching acceptance, as if he had reached some understanding with whatever was creating the disturbances. We sat together in the darkness, listening to the rhythmic knocking that had become as regular as breathing. As dawn approached, the sounds began to fade, not stopping abruptly as they had on previous nights, but diminishing gradually like a radio being turned down slowly. The ocean smell receded with them, replaced by the familiar sense of morning coffee from neighboring apartments and the exhaust from traffic beginning to build on the streets below. When my friend returned that afternoon, he found the apartment exactly as he had left it. The plants were watered, the cat was fed, the mail was neatly stacked on the kitchen counter. He thanked me for my help and mentioned that the building management had received several noise complaints from other floors during the week, something about water damage in the walls causing strange sounds at night. I nodded and handed him the keys, keeping the notebook tucked safely in my pocket. Some experiences resist explanation, exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt where truth becomes a matter of personal conviction rather than observable fact. Whether I had encountered something genuinely supernatural or had simply spent a week documenting my own descent into temporary madness was a question I knew I would never be able to answer definitively. But late at night, in my own apartment several miles away, I sometimes catch the faint scent of salt air drifting through sealed windows, and I know that certain boundaries, once crossed, can never be fully recrossed. The knocking has followed me home, softer now but unmistakably present, reminding me that some invitations, once accepted, become permanent arrangements. The city spreads below my window, all lights and movement, and the comfortable illusion of human control over the unknown. But I know now that we are always only visitors in spaces we believe we own, temporary guests in a reality far larger and stranger than our daily routines allow us to acknowledge. And sometimes, just sometimes, our hosts decide to make themselves known.